Section 1. The Death That Broke the Internet. Brian Griffin's End. Settle in, get comfortable, let the room go quiet around you, and just let me carry you somewhere familiar, somewhere animated, somewhere that used to feel like home every Sunday night. We're going back to a world you know well. The smell of a Rhode Island autumn hanging over Spooner Street. The distant sound of a television somewhere down the hall. A family loud, imperfect, deeply strange, living out their little lives in Stoolbend. No, not Stoolbend. Sorry. In their little corner of Rhode Island. And somewhere in that house, padding across the linoleum kitchen floor on 4 white paws, is a dog who could talk. A dog who could drive a car, order a dry martini, argue about Hemingway, and love his family in a way that was somehow more real than most of the human beings surrounding him. His name was Brian Griffin, and in the fall of 2013 he died. Not forever, but for a moment, for a few weeks of real time, for what felt like an eternity to the people who had grown up watching him. Brian Griffin was gone. And the way it happened, the specific, quiet cruelty of it, is exactly the kind of story that lingers in your mind long after the screen goes dark. Let me take you back. The 24th of November, 2013. Season 12, Episode 6. The title is almost cruelly simple. Life of Brian. It starts the way so many Family Guy stories start, which is to say, it starts almost accidentally. There's no grand setup, no slow-building dramatic tension pulling you toward what's coming. Brian and Stewie are out on Spooner Street, setting up a net in the road so they can play a little street hockey together. It's a quiet, almost sweet image, the baby and the dog, in the afternoon light doing something completely ordinary. Stewie heads back inside for his knee pads. He's only gone for a moment, and a car comes around the corner. The driver doesn't stop. The show doesn't linger on it with any kind of theatrical flair. There's no slow motion, no swelling music, no dramatic last words or meaningful glance between Brian and Stewie before it happens. It just happens. One moment Brian is standing in the street. The next, he's been hit. And what follows is genuinely, unexpectedly heartbreaking. The Griffin family rushing to the vet, sitting in that cold waiting room, the overhead fluorescent lights humming above them, while the vet comes out and tells them quietly that Brian's injuries are too severe, that there's nothing more they can do. And Brian Griffin, talking dog, failed novelist, dry martini enthusiast, voice of unreliable reason, dies surrounded by his family. The scene at his bedside is the thing that got people. Because the show, which had spent years being loud and irreverent and gleefully chaotic, suddenly went very, very quiet. The Griffins gathered around him. Peter, who had been Brian's best friend since the beginning of everything, stood there looking lost in a way that Peter Griffin almost never looked lost. And Brian, in his final moments, told them he loved them. He told them he had a good life. And then he was gone. What happened next in the real world was something nobody at the show had fully predicted. Seth MacFarlane would later say they were surprised, genuinely surprised by the reaction. They knew there would be buzz. They knew fans would be upset. What they did not expect was the scale of it. Brian's death trended on social media for days. It made national news. Entertainment outlets that wouldn't normally cover the passing of an animated dog character covered it like it was a real cultural event. Petitions appeared online demanding the writers bring Brian back. People who hadn't watched the show regularly in years found themselves unexpectedly devastated. There was something about it that cut through the irony and the distance that usually surrounds this kind of animated comedy. Because here's the thing about Brian Griffin that gets easy to forget when you're talking about the show's later seasons and all the ways his character drifted. When Brian was at his best in those early seasons, in those quieter, sharper moments, he was the character the audience was supposed to see themselves in. He was the one who felt real. He was the voice that wasn't quite as unhinged as everyone else around him. The one who registered the absurdity of his situation and responded to it with something close to genuine emotion. He was the one who felt things. And when he died, even in the context of a cartoon, even knowing on some level that death in animation rarely sticks, it felt like losing a friend. The replacement they introduced didn't help. A dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, moved in with the Griffin family in the episodes that followed. Vinny was a good-natured, thick-accented Italian-American dog from New York, and there was nothing inherently wrong with him as a character. He had moments. He bonded with Stewie in a way that was genuinely sweet, particularly a scene where Vinny tells Stewie about losing his own previous owner, opening up about grief in a way that felt sincere. But Vinny was also, undeniably, a reminder of what wasn't there anymore. Every time he appeared on screen, he occupied the space where Brian was supposed to be, and that space felt wrong. But then came the reversal. 2 episodes after Life of Brian aired, the Christmas episode titled Christmas Guy brought something remarkable with it. Stewie, grieving and desperate, ends up at a toy store and spots another version of himself, a Stewie from a slightly different point in the timeline, one who had traveled forward in time to get ahead of the Christmas toy rush. Stewie intercepts this alternate version of himself and takes his time travel device. And with it, he goes back. He goes back to that afternoon on Spooner Street, back to the moment before the car came around the corner. He pushes Brian out of the way. And Brian Griffin lives. The reunion between them, Stewie running to Brian completely bewildered, Stewie clinging to him with a ferocity that the show rarely allowed its characters to express, landed harder than almost anything the show had done in years. Because Stewie's love for Brian, underneath all the genius baby theatrics and the elaborate schemes, was always the most genuine emotional relationship the show had. And seeing it stripped bare like that, seeing Stewie willing to erase timelines just to have his friend back, reminded everyone watching exactly what they had thought they were losing. Seth MacFarlane later described the plan behind all of this as a warm, fuzzy holiday lesson, the idea being that you don't know what you have until it's gone, and that the audience needed to feel that loss in order to appreciate Brian's presence again. Executive producer Steve Callahan said the idea came out of the writer's room as a way to shake things up, to do something genuinely unexpected, to remind audiences that the show could still surprise them. And to be fair, it worked. The ratings spike around those episodes was real. People were watching and talking in a way they hadn't been for years. But the criticism that followed was equally real. Because killing a beloved character and then resurrecting them a month later in a Christmas special sends a very specific message to your audience. It says, nothing we show you is permanent. Nothing we do to these characters has any lasting weight. You can feel things, but those feelings will be resolved quickly and cleanly. And once an audience understands that nothing can really happen in a show, that no consequence will stick, that no moment of genuine change will be allowed to hold something, curdles in the relationship between the story and the people watching it. The death of Brian and his rapid return sits at the center of something important about what Family Guy became in its middle and later seasons. The show understood how to create moments that felt significant. It understood the grammar of grief and loss and love. What it struggled with, what it consistently walked away from, was the harder work of letting those moments mean something beyond their own immediate impact. The death of Brian was enormous. It was a genuine event. And then it was undone, neatly and cleverly, in a way that was also enormous and event-like. And the net result was a show that had briefly felt like it could really break your heart, pulling back from the edge at the last possible second. Brian's safety deposit box tells its own quiet story within all of this. Because long before Brian died on Spooner Street, before the car came around the corner, the show had already revealed something very dark sitting inside a bank vault. In the Season 8 episode that simply bears the names of its 2 main characters, Brian and Stewie, the 2 of them get accidentally locked in that vault over a weekend. And when the dramatics of their initial panic fade and the whiskey runs low and they're just sitting there in the silence, Stewie asks Brian about the gun in his safety deposit box. Why does Brian Griffin, who wept after Columbine, who advocates loudly for gun control, keep a loaded revolver in a bank vault? And Brian tells him he keeps it because there are days when he doesn't want to be alive anymore. Days when the weight of his failed writing, his loneliness, his sense that he has never quite become the thing he was supposed to be, when all of that becomes too much. The gun is a contingency, an exit. Something about the quiet certainty with which Brian explains this, the lack of drama in the confession, hits differently than almost anything else the show produced in that era. Stewie's reaction, the genuine fear on his face, the desperate way he asks Brian never to use it, is one of the few moments in the show's later run that feels completely unfiltered and true. So, before Brian died in the street, he was already living with a death he had been quietly contemplating. And maybe that's why the loss of him hit so hard when it finally came. Because the audience had already been given a glimpse of the fragile, complicated inner life of this dog who talked and drank and tried so hard to be more than he was. He was a character who felt like he was always one bad day away from something irreversible. And for 3 weeks in November of 2013, the show let you believe that the irreversible had finally arrived. It hadn't. But for a moment, It felt so real that millions of people were genuinely, unexpectedly devastated. And that, more than the ratings and the social media frenzy and the think pieces that followed, might be the most remarkable thing about the whole story. A cartoon dog dying on a Sunday night in November made people feel something they weren't prepared to feel. And that is the power that Family Guy, at its best and at its strangest, always had lurking somewhere underneath the jokes. Hey, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who's out there. And if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe so you never miss an upload. Section 2. The simulation that ended everything. Stewie kills Lois. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from watching something you always feared actually happen. A slow, building unease that says, this is the moment. This is when the thing that has always been hovering at the edge finally steps forward into the light. In the world of Family Guy, that dread had a name, and its name was Stewie Griffin. And for 6 seasons, audiences had been waiting half amused, half genuinely unsettled for the moment when the baby with the British accent and the ray gun would finally stop talking about killing his mother and actually do it. In November of 2007, in the 4th and 5th episodes of Season 6, the show let him. To understand the full weight of what Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie meant to the people watching, you have to understand what Stewie had been for the first 3 seasons of the show. He was not simply a funny baby with a quirky personality. He was something genuinely disturbing, a character whose central defining feature was that he had been planning to commit matricide since he could form coherent sentences. In Season 1, Stewie's storylines were almost entirely organized around 2 obsessions: killing Lois and taking over the world. He built ray guns in his crib. He constructed mind control devices in his bedroom while his family slept down the hall. He delivered long, elaborate, perfectly formed speeches about world domination while sitting in a high chair and eating pureed carrots. The comedy came from the gap. The enormous, almost surreal gap between what Stewie looked like, a chubby, yellow-shirted baby in a football-shaped head, and what Stewie actually was, which was something closer to a Bond villain with a diaper and an Oxbridge education. The fact that none of the adults around him could hear what he was actually saying made every scene between Stewie and Lois carry a kind of underlying tension. She would pick him up and hug him and tell him how much she loved him, completely unaware that the child in her arms was, at that exact moment, mentally cataloging her weaknesses. The audience knew. Lois didn't. And that dramatic irony gave every single domestic moment between them a faint, dark edge. By seasons 4 and 5, the writers had already begun pulling Stewie away from his original character. The world domination plots were becoming less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life were more occasional, more half-hearted. Stewie was increasingly focused on his friendship with Brian, on questions of personal identity, on the emotional landscape of a character who was starting to seem less like a criminal mastermind and more like a very precocious child with unusual hobbies. The show was quietly retiring the original Stewie without saying goodbye. Stewie Kills Lois was, in many ways, that goodbye. And it was written to feel like the payoff that 6 years of setup had been building toward. The setup for the episode is almost mundane by the show's standards. Brian gives Lois cruise tickets as a birthday present. Lois decides to take Peter on the cruise with her and leave the kids behind. Stewie, furious at being excluded, snaps. His long simmering resentment toward Lois, toward her cheerful obliviousness, her casual neglect, her infuriating refusal to take seriously the many elaborate schemes he had been constructing since infancy, boils over into something decisive. He follows the cruise ship. He shoots Lois. He watches her fall overboard into the dark ocean below. And then, in one of the show's most audacious tonal swings, time jumps forward a year, a full year. Lois is presumed dead. Peter is on trial for her murder, having given a series of catastrophically incriminating statements to investigators. Stewie has quietly and calmly moved on, only occasionally mentioning to Brian, almost as an aside, that yes, he was the one who killed her. There is something genuinely chilling about the casual way the episode handles this. Stewie's pride is quiet and almost bored. The pride of someone who has accomplished a long-anticipated task and found it less emotionally satisfying than anticipated. The moment when Lois reveals herself to still be alive walking into Peter's court proceedings, at the exact moment he is about to receive a life sentence, is played as a relief and a shock simultaneously. She had been rescued by a merman after falling into the ocean. She had developed amnesia, She had ended up working as a counselor at a weight loss camp in North Carolina. The explanation is deliberately absurd, a signal that the show is playing in the heightened register of its most operatic storytelling. This isn't grounded drama. It's something stranger and more deliberately theatrical. Part 2 picks up immediately, and what it delivers is something the show had been promising since its very first season. Stewie, exposed, goes full villain. He flees to Washington, D.C. He takes over the country. He achieves the dream he has been nurturing for 6 years, actual functioning world domination. He becomes the dictator he always said he would be. He institutes laws banning direct-to-video Disney releases. He has Brian at his side as a reluctant accomplice. He has Patrick Stewart voicing Avery Bullock from American Dad appearing as a character, which gives the whole thing an extra layer of absurdist delight. And then Lois comes for him. The fight between Lois and Stewie that closes out Lois Kills Stewie is one of the most genuinely exciting action sequences the show had ever produced up to that point. Lois is not the meek, patient housewife who just endured Stewie's schemes with benign obliviousness. When she comes for him, she comes with intent. The two of them tear through the White House in a fight that is simultaneously funny and legitimately tense. A mother and her murderous infant doing genuine serious damage to each other. Stewie takes a bullet. He falls. It looks, for a moment, like this is actually how it ends. And then the twist arrives. Brian is sitting in Stewie's room. Stewie emerges from his computer, where he has been running a simulation, a sophisticated digital model of exactly how things would play out if he actually went through with killing Lois. Everything we've watched for 2 episodes was Stewie's projection, his attempt to game out the consequences before committing. And the simulation showed him something he wasn't expecting. It showed him that taking his revenge would lead not to satisfaction and world domination, but to defeat. To Lois, furious and capable and ultimately more than a match for him. To a world that did not welcome his rule as enthusiastically as he had imagined. Stewie tells Brian, almost quietly, that things didn't work out so well in the simulation, that his plans will have to wait. The fan response to the twist was complicated from the beginning and has only grown more layered over the years. Some people loved it, the cleverness of it, the way it acknowledged that the show couldn't actually let Stewie win without breaking the format entirely. Some found it a frustrating cheat, a refusal to commit to the consequences of its own boldest storytelling. What almost everyone agreed on, though, was that these 2 episodes represented something rare, a genuine creative swing. The show had taken its most iconic running gag and explored it to its absolute logical endpoint, then pulled back with a twist that was at least interesting enough to argue about. What makes the simulation reveal land differently in retrospect is what it says about Stewie himself. Because in choosing not to kill Lois even in the privacy of his own simulation, even in the outcome where he succeeds, Stewie is revealing something. The evil genius baby, the character defined by his matricidal ambition and his desire for world domination, looked at the version of himself who actually won and found it hollow. Found it worse than where he started. There's something unexpectedly poignant in that, buried underneath all the high-concept plotting and the action set pieces. The villain who has been threatening to destroy everything he knows turns out to be, on some level, unable to actually let go of the world he claims to hate. After these episodes, the show never really returned to this version of Stewie in any serious way. The attempts on Lois's life became increasingly rare and eventually vestigial, referenced as a kind of nostalgic shorthand rather than a genuine character trait. The world domination schemes faded. Stewie's storylines moved toward personal identity, friendship, emotional growth. The evil genius baby became, gradually, something warmer and more conventional. And while there are arguments to be made for what the character gained in that transition, and we'll explore those more closely later, what he lost was the only version of Family Guy that felt genuinely dangerous. The Stewie Kills Lois 2-parter is still regularly cited as one of the last truly great ambitious episodes the show produced. And there's a particular sadness in that because it was also, in a sense, a funeral. A goodbye to the most original character the show ever invented, dressed up as the climax of everything he had ever promised. The show let Stewie do the thing in simulation, in imagination, in the only safe space available, and then it let him walk away from it. Let him choose, quietly and without fanfare, to remain in the life he had rather than the destruction he had been planning. There is something almost gentle in that, something almost peaceful. The baby who wanted to end the world decided, when he looked closely enough at what ending the world would actually look like, that he'd rather stay home and watch television with his dog. And maybe that's the most human thing Stewie Griffin ever did. Section 3. What Peter Griffin became the slow collapse of a family man. In the early days, Peter Griffin was not a complicated man. He was simple in the way that certain kinds of people are genuinely, authentically simple, not stupid in a cruel or calculated way, but limited in a way that was entirely without malice. He worked at a toy factory. He drank at the Drunken Clam with his friends. He watched a lot of television. He made decisions that were bad decisions almost universally, but he made them with a kind of cheerful obliviousness that kept them in the territory of slapstick rather than cruelty. When things went wrong, and things always went wrong, Peter would eventually realize it. He would feel bad. He would apologize to Lois, and she would forgive him, and they would hug, and the episode would end with something like warmth. That version of Peter Griffin feels very far away now. The transformation of Peter from the show's lovable, dim-witted center into something genuinely harder to watch is one of those changes that happens so gradually you can almost miss it in the moment. Looking back at the full arc is where it becomes undeniable. Season 1 Peter and Season 14 Peter are separated by so much more than the passage of time. They are, in meaningful ways, different people. Or rather, one of them is a person, and the other is something that has been hollowed out and refilled with a darker, louder, crueler substance. The clinical term for what happened to Peter Griffin is Flanderization, borrowing its name from Ned Flanders of The Simpsons, a character who went from being a complex, well-meaning neighbor with genuine depth to being nothing but his religiosity, reduced to a single trait stretched thin over the bones of what had once been a whole human being. Family Guy did the same thing to Peter, but with a more disturbing result, because the trait that took over wasn't something harmless or merely annoying. What consumed Peter Griffin was a kind of aggressive, self-centered cruelty that the show had never intended for him at the start. In the early seasons, Peter's stupidity felt grounded. He made terrible decisions because he didn't think things through, but there was always an emotional logic underneath his actions. He wanted to be liked. He wanted his wife to love him. He wanted, in his fumbling and catastrophically inept way, to be a good father and a good friend and a good man. When he failed at these things, which was constantly, it was because he lacked the tools to succeed, not because he didn't care. That caring, that buried but genuine warmth, is what made him lovable. Starting around Season 4 and accelerating sharply from Season 8 onward, that caring disappeared. What replaced it was something the writers seemed to believe was funnier, but which was actually something quite different from funny. Peter began doing things that weren't stupid, they were mean. Actively, intentionally, deliberately mean in ways that couldn't be explained by simple dim-wittedness. He pushed Lois underwater during a shark scare and fled in the boat, leaving her behind. He stole Halloween candy from Stewie, his own infant son. He got Joe Swanson, his best friend, to cheat on his wife by actively encouraging the affair. He worked to get Brian fired from a job out of nothing more than jealousy. These are not the actions of a lovable idiot. These are the actions of someone who has organized his interior life around self-interest in a way that leaves no room for anyone else. The distinction matters enormously. Comedy can live with a character who does stupid things. That's the foundation of most physical comedy. But comedy curdles when the character doing the things doesn't care who gets hurt. When the cruelty is the point. When the damage is the punchline. The moment that most clearly encapsulates what had gone wrong with Peter's character arrives in Season 10's Seahorse Seashell Party, but it belongs in this section as much as anywhere else. Meg Griffin, after years of being used as the family's collective punching bag, finally breaks. She confronts her family in a speech that covers everything: her father's cruelty, her mother's complicity, the way the entire household has organized itself around the ritual degradation of one of its members. She turns to Peter specifically and tells him he is completely selfish and utterly irresponsible. She tells him he has no education, no interests, and no awareness of the damage he does. She tells him he would be in jail if the outside world could see how he treats his own daughter. Every word she says is accurate. The show acknowledges this. It doesn't try to soften or dispute Meg's assessment. What makes Peter's response so damning is that he finds it funny. He laughs. Not the confused laugh of a man who doesn't understand what's being said to him. Not the deflecting laugh of someone who is embarrassed and covering it. He laughs the way someone laughs when they're being entertained. The cruelty directed at his own daughter is, to him, amusing. The Peter Griffin of Season 1 would have been hurt by those words. He might not have fully processed them. His response might have been clumsy and inadequate in its own right. But he would have felt something. The Peter of the later seasons felt nothing, and the show presented this as normal, as the baseline condition of its main character. His treatment of Meg traces the full arc of what happened to Peter most clearly. In the beginning, their relationship was simply typical. A daughter who felt overlooked, a father who was too absorbed in his own chaos to give her the attention she needed. There were insensitivities and thoughtless comments, but there were also moments of genuine connection. Peter loved Meg in the early seasons. Not perfectly, not consistently, but he loved her. By the later seasons, that love had been replaced by something that the show coded as comedy, but that watched much more like contempt. He insulted her appearance constantly and with deliberate cruelty. He physically embarrassed her in ways that would read as abuse in any realistic context. A flashback revealed that he and Lois had once tried to abandon infant Meg at a fire station, and this was presented as a punchline. There is an episode in the later run called Peter's Sister that tries to explain all of this. It reveals that Peter was himself the victim of abuse growing up, that his sister physically and emotionally tormented him, and that this pattern repeated itself in how he treated Meg. It is a genuinely strong episode, one of the more psychologically honest things the show attempted in its later seasons. Peter and Meg have a real reconciliation. Peter acknowledges what he's done, Meg extends compassion to him. For one episode, the show looked directly at the damage and tried to make sense of it. Then the next episode aired, and everything reset. Peter was back to treating Meg the way he always had. The insight evaporated. The reconciliation left no trace. This is the pattern that, more than any specific cruel joke or specific terrible action, defines what happened to Peter Griffin over the show's run. The show could write him better. There are episodes scattered across later seasons that demonstrate this clearly. Episodes where Peter is kind or genuinely funny in the old way, or even briefly capable of something resembling wisdom. These episodes exist. They prove that the version of Peter from the early seasons never entirely disappeared from the writer's imagination. He was still in there somewhere, accessible when the writing room wanted to find him. But the dominant Peter, the Peter who showed up week after week and drove the central plots of most episodes, was someone else. Someone who had been slowly, incrementally stripped of everything that had once made him warm. The lovable fool became a vehicle for a kind of comedy that wasn't actually comedy, it was just behavior that was extreme enough to generate a reaction. Peter Griffin, at his worst, was the show asking its audience to laugh at something that would have made the show's original audience deeply uncomfortable. The physical comedy changed too, in ways that mirror this larger shift. The early Peter comedy was slapstick in the classical tradition, exaggerated, bouncy, the consequences temporary and cartoonishly reversible. Falls and crashes and comically misguided physical endeavors. The later seasons introduced something darker into the physical humor. Injuries became more graphic. The violence became more detailed and more realistic in its presentation. Scenes of Peter causing serious harm to other characters, drawn with what appeared to be deliberate attention to the physiological specifics of what that harm looked like, accumulated over the seasons until they formed their own disturbing subcategory of the show's content. The famous recurring chicken fight, those epic, sprawling battles between Peter and the giant Ernie the chicken that began in Season 2 and continued periodically through the show's run, offers a clear window into this transition. In the early versions, the chicken fights were spectacular and absurd, cartoonish in the best sense. Peter and Ernie destroying increasingly unlikely environments in service of a grudge so petty it was almost abstract. By later seasons, the same format carried a different energy. The humor had not changed. The execution had. The physical consequences were rendered with more detail, more commitment to showing what it would actually look like if two people really did that to each other. The cartoon wrapper remained, but the content inside it had shifted into something less innocent. Peter's friendships with Joe and Quagmire offer the final piece of this portrait. In Season 1, Joe Swanson was introduced as the cool new neighbor, the wheelchair-using police officer who commanded everyone's admiration, including Peter's. Peter was actively jealous of Joe. Joe was impressive. He was capable and respected and genuinely admired by the people around him. Over the years, that image eroded. Joe's disability became a punchline. His marriage fell apart. The friends who had once admired him began, collectively and with Peter often leading the charge, to mock him instead. The man who inspired jealousy became the man who inspired contempt. And Peter, who had once been jealous of Joe's success, became one of the chief architects of that contempt. The character who was once, in his own fumbling way, trying to keep up with his cooler neighbors, became the character who tore them down. That's not a comedic character arc. That's something darker. Section 4. Meg and the 10-season descent. The punching bag that wasn't supposed to speak back. Pour yourself something warm. Find a comfortable position. Because this section of our journey tonight is the one that, more than any other, sits at the intersection of dark comedy and something genuinely uncomfortable, the story of Meg Griffin, who started as a background character and became, over the course of a decade of television, something between a running joke and a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the show around her. Meg Griffin, voiced by Mila Kunis from Season 2 onward, after the pilot featured actress Lacey Chabert in the role. Meg Griffin, teenager, daughter of Peter and Lois, student at James Woods Regional High School, resident of Spooner Street. In Season 1, Meg was simply the ordinary one. The relatable one, perhaps, the character who anchored the family in something like normalcy. She was unpopular at school, she wanted to fit in and largely failed. She was a little boring compared to the rest of her family. That was the joke, and it was a gentle one. In a household containing a failed novelist dog, an evil genius baby, a reckless man-child husband, and a woman holding everything together through sheer force of patient competence, the teenage girl who just wanted to get through high school and have a few friends read as almost aggressively ordinary. The contrast was the comedy, her normalcy in the face of everyone else's strangeness. That joke could have sustained itself indefinitely. It was a workable, even interesting premise. The ordinary person in the extraordinary family, the human-scale perspective amid all the chaos. It didn't require Meg to be interesting herself, it just required her to serve as a kind of grounding reference point, the audience surrogate who found the rest of her family as baffling as anyone watching at home. But somewhere around Season 4, after the show came back from cancellation and the writing room had shifted and the priorities had changed, the joke changed too. Meg stopped being the ordinary one in a strange family. She became a target, and the target was, specifically, her appearance. Characters began reacting to her with visible disgust. They would recoil when she entered a room. They would make comments about her face and her body. Peter, who had simply been inattentive in the early seasons, began being actively, pointedly cruel. The joke stopped being about Meg being boring and started being about Meg deserving to be mocked for existing the way she existed. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and it matters. Comedy about a person being unremarkable doesn't require the audience to feel contempt for that person. Comedy about a person being ugly or being treated as if they were ugly does. It asks the audience to share in the contempt, to find it funny that this specific body, this specific face, this specific person is the object of ridicule. That's a very different emotional transaction than laughing at someone's boring taste in music. And the show made that transition without appearing to notice what it had crossed into. By seasons 8 through 14, the Meg abuse had become one of the show's defining features. Peter farted in her face as entertainment. He physically pushed her and insulted her in ways that would, in any realistic context, constitute abuse. Lois, who had been a warm, if imperfect mother in the early seasons, became cold and dismissive. Chris joined in. Stewie, who barely interacted with Meg at all in the original run, began tossing casual cruelty her way. The entire household had collectively organized itself around the proposition that Meg Griffin deserved to be treated as less than the rest of them. The outside world mirrored it. At school, the bullying from Connie D'Amico, Meg's perpetual tormentor and social nemesis, escalated. Teachers were indifferent or actively cruel. Random encounters with strangers in the wider world of the show treated Meg with the same contempt her family did, as if the entire fictional universe had reached a quiet consensus that this one person was uniquely deserving of mistreatment. The real-world bleed was remarkable enough that Mila Kunis, the woman who gave Meg her voice, has talked about it publicly. People would approach Kunis and direct at her the specific dismissive phrase that became the show's shorthand for Peter's treatment of his daughter, taking the fictional cruelty and aiming it at the actual human being who voiced the character. The joke had escaped its container. Then came Seahorse Seashell Party, Season 10, Episode 2. The episode that fans still argue about, the one where Meg finally breaks open. The setup is almost incidental. The Griffin family is trapped at home during a hurricane. Brian, in one of his more questionable life choices, has consumed magic mushrooms and is in the middle of a hallucinogenic trip that Stewie is carefully managing. The rest of the family is bored, irritable, and taking it out on Meg in the usual ways. And Meg, after years of absorbing it, after a decade of being the family's designated target snaps, what follows is one of the most surprising sequences the show had produced in years, because Meg's speech is good. It's well observed and specific, and it comes from a real place, from a character who had been allowed to accumulate genuine grievances and who had finally reached the point where the weight of them was too much to keep quiet. She tears into her father with specific accuracy. His selfishness, his recklessness, his cruelty, the way he has treated her since before she could remember. She turns on her mother. The complicity, the willingness to let it happen, the failure of protection that mothers are supposed to provide. She goes through all of them, and something unexpected happens. The family, deprived of their usual lightning rod, turns on each other. Without Meg to absorb the collective dysfunction, the household fractures, Peter goes after Lois, Chris goes after Peter. The whole carefully maintained social architecture of the Griffin family collapses into mutual recrimination. The episode shows you, clearly and deliberately, that the family's apparent stability was entirely dependent on having one member who absorbed the abuse that would otherwise destroy the relationships between everyone else. It is a genuinely dark and genuinely interesting insight. And then the episode does something with it that made a lot of people very angry. Meg goes to Brian. She asks him whether she should keep being what she has been, the lightning rod, the punching bag, the absorber of everyone's worst impulses. Brian doesn't fight the premise. He agrees with her assessment. He tells her that the family needs her to play this role, that without her absorbing the dysfunction, they'll destroy each other. And Meg accepts this. She goes back to her family and tells them she was lying when she stood up for herself. She takes back everything she said. She resumes her position at the bottom of the hierarchy. The episode's final message is not subtle. Victims of abuse should accept their role because it serves the greater good of the people abusing them. Standing up for yourself is, if anything, a selfish act. It disrupts the people who have been hurting you and makes life harder for them. The right thing to do is to go back, quietly, and resume being hurt. That the show presented this as something close to a resolution, even a noble one. Meg choosing to sacrifice herself for her family's stability says something uncomfortable about the assumptions built into the episode's writing. There's no indication that the writers intended it as an indictment. There's no frame around Meg's choice that marks it as tragic or wrong. It's just what happens, and the credits roll, and the next episode begins with things exactly as they were. What makes this especially frustrating is that the show knew how to write Meg better. It had proven this. In the Simpsons crossover episode in season 13, Meg meets Lisa Simpson, and the episode treats Meg as a person with depth and talent and unrealized potential, someone who just needed the right encouragement to discover who she was. Lisa helps Meg find her musical ability. They become genuine friends. It is a genuinely warm and well-written storyline, and Meg in that episode feels like a character that someone cared about. In Peter's Sister in season 14, the show built a real explanation for the dynamic and offered a real emotional reconciliation between Peter and Meg. It worked. It was honest and affecting, and it suggested that the show could, if it wanted to, give Meg something better than the decade she'd been having. But the episodes that followed were the same as the episodes that came before. The reset button, reliably pressed. The character who could have been something returned, episode after episode, to being nothing more than the thing she'd been assigned to be. Around season 15, the tide began to shift. Women joining the writing staff pushed back against the relentless cruelty. The Meg abuse began to diminish. By season 22, the extreme treatment had largely stopped. Meg was getting episodes where she was competent, even formidable. She fought back. She had storylines where she wasn't the punchline. The character, after a decade of being defined by her suffering, was being allowed to become something else. But the damage was already written. 10 seasons of a show telling its audience that this specific person was the appropriate target of contempt, that her suffering was inherently funny, that she deserved what she got. 10 seasons of that leaves a mark. Not just on the fictional universe, but on the audience that absorbed those years of the same joke told in progressively less gentle ways. Meg Griffin is, in a strange way, the most human character on the show. She wants to be loved. She wants to belong. She wants her parents to see her as worthy of their attention. These are the most fundamental human desires. the ones most people carry somewhere close to the center of themselves. And for 10 seasons, the show punished her for having them, made those desires themselves the subject of mockery, turned the very fact of wanting to be treated with basic dignity into something the audience was expected to find contemptible. That is not comedy, it is something else. And the fact that the show eventually moved away from it, eventually let Meg be a person again, doesn't erase the decade that came before. It just stands alongside it, a quiet acknowledgement that the joke had always been the wrong one. It just took a very long time for enough people in the room to say so. Section 5. Inside the bank vault, the night Brian and Stewie told each other the truth. There is a particular quality to silence in a confined space. The way it thickens around you, the way small sounds of breath, a shift in weight, the soft settling of the walls become enormous in the absence of anything else to hear. You become very aware of the person you're with. Their breathing becomes a kind of conversation. You can't avoid each other, can't fill the space with distraction or busyness. You're just there, together, in the quiet, with nothing between you but whatever you're both carrying. Season 8 of Family Guy was, by general agreement, not one of the show's finest hours. But buried inside it, airing on the 2nd of May 2010, was something so different from everything else the show had produced that it still gets discussed in almost reverent terms by people who watched it when it first aired. The episode is the show's 150th overall. It's simply called Brian and Stewie. And it is, by a wide margin, the most psychologically honest thing Family Guy ever did. The premise is almost absurdly simple. Brian goes to his bank to visit his safety deposit box. Stewie tags along. The vault door closes while they're still inside. The bank closes for the weekend. And Brian and Stewie spend the next day and a half trapped together in a steel room with nothing but each other, Stewie's emergency supplies, a bottle of scotch, and whatever they've been keeping from themselves. What makes the episode remarkable before a single word of dialogue is spoken is what it refuses to do. There are no cutaway gags. Not one. In a show that had made the cutaway gag its most recognizable feature, its signature, its brand in a show that had been building its identity around that format since the very first episode, Brian and Stewie eliminates them entirely. There's no music either. No background score setting the emotional temperature for you. No cue telling you how to feel. There's just two characters in a room. Just Seth MacFarlane, essentially, talking to himself in two very different voices in a way that manages to feel like two completely separate and genuine people having the most honest conversation either of them has ever had. The first section of the episode is played for discomfort more than laughs. Stewie has soiled his diaper, the vault door closing frightened him, and there's nothing to be done about it. Brian has to deal with it. This part of the episode is genuinely unpleasant in a way that feels deliberate. The show is stripping away the distance and the elegance that usually surrounds these two characters and putting them in the most fundamentally unglamorous situation possible. No adventures, no time machines, no schemes, just the basic indignant reality of being alive and having a body that does what bodies do in a context where that is nobody's idea of fun. Then the scotch comes out, and the conversation begins to drift toward deeper water. There's a moment, about halfway through the episode, where Stewie, having sobered slightly after the initial crisis, having had time to look around the vault and take stock of their situation, notices something. The safety deposit box that Brian visited contained, among other things, a gun, a loaded revolver. Stewie knows enough about Brian to find this strange. Brian has always been a vocal advocate for gun control. He cried after Columbine. He finds gun culture alienating and troubling. So why, Stewie asks, does Brian Griffin own a gun? And Brian tells him, he keeps it because there are days when he doesn't want to be alive anymore. Days when the sum of his failures, the unfinished novel, the string of relationships that didn't work out, the sense of having always been on the edge of becoming something meaningful, without ever quite arriving there, becomes too much to carry. The gun is an insurance policy, a contingency, an exit kept in a steel box in a vault, far enough away that he'd have to make a deliberate decision to reach for it. The silence after this confession is real. You can feel it. Stewie's response, the way his voice changes, the way the comedy falls away from him and what's left is something more naked is one of Seth MacFarlane's finest pieces of voice acting. The fear in Stewie's reaction is not the theatrical fear of someone reacting to an event. It's the quieter, colder fear of someone who has just realized that the person they care most about in the world has been carrying something this heavy and that they had no idea. The conversation that follows goes to places that Family Guy had never gone before and hasn't gone to in quite the same way since. They talk about what makes life worth living. Brian asks Stewie what the point of it is, what the point of any of it is. The daily effort and the disappointments and the love that keeps being insufficient. Stewie, who at the start of the episode seemed like the more volatile and unstable of the two, turns out to be the one with the clearer answer. His answer is essentially you, the friendship. The specific, unrepeatable fact of this relationship, this combination of two very strange beings who have somehow become essential to each other, it is not a grand philosophical argument. It is not something that would survive rigorous examination in a seminar room. It is the kind of answer that only works between two specific people in a specific moment of honest reckoning. And it works, here, completely. The episode ends with the vault being discovered when the bank reopens on Monday. Brian and Stewie emerge, blinking in the light, and return to the show's usual format. The jokes resume. The cutaways return in subsequent episodes. The conversation they had in the vault is not mentioned again, not referenced, not built upon in any explicit way. It lives in the vault, sealed away. The way that certain conversations between close friends exist in a kind of separate space from the rest of the relationship, things that were said once, things that both people know were said, things that change something even when they're never spoken of again. What Brian and Stewie does that almost nothing else in the show's long run manages is prove a point that the show's critics had been making for years. The cutaway gags, the random sketches, the parade of disconnected jokes, none of that was essential. The show could create something extraordinary without any of it. All it needed were the characters and an honest willingness to sit with them in a confined space and let them be real. The episode also does something quietly devastating for Brian's character specifically, because in the years that followed, in the seasons where Brian became increasingly insufferable, increasingly arrogant and self-serving, and hollow the gun in the safety deposit box becomes a piece of contextual information that changes everything. The Brian who is being pretentious and insufferable and cruel is also the Brian who keeps a loaded weapon for use on the days when he can't justify being alive. Those two things coexist in the same character. The arrogance is not the whole of him. It never was. And the episode that reveals the hidden thing makes it impossible to simply dismiss the character in the way that later seasons seem to want you to. Brian Griffin is not just a fraud and a hypocrite and a disappointment. He is also someone in pain who loves his friend enough to tell him the truth. And those things are both true at the same time. That is, it turns out, what a real person looks like. Section 6. Brenda Q and the episode nobody wanted to find funny. Sometimes a show stumbles into honesty, not through deliberate artistry or careful construction, but because it wanders into territory so serious that the usual protective layer of irony and exaggeration can't maintain itself, and what's underneath shows through. Screams of silence. The story of Brenda Q, Season 10, Episode 3, airing on the 30th of October 2011, is one of those moments. And it is, depending on who you ask, either the most important episode the show ever made or the most troubling, or somehow both at once. It begins, characteristically enough for Family Guy, as a background joke. Quagmire mentions that he's been sheltering his sister. He says it the way the show often drops these details casually, in passing, as a piece of character business that exists to set up something else. Then his sister Brenda arrives, and with her comes Jeff, her boyfriend, later her fiancé, and something changes in the episode's tone almost immediately. Jeff is not played for laughs. He is not an absurdist caricature in the way that most of the show's antagonists are. He is a very specific kind of man, recognizable in a way that domestic abuse statistics make unsurprising. Controlling, volatile, cruel in the particular way that cruelty operates in close relationships, where the violence and the tenderness alternate in ways that make it genuinely difficult for the person being hurt to leave. The show presents his behavior with a directness that was genuinely jarring in context. Brenda defends him. She explains him away. She reacts to concern with anger, the way people sometimes do when the concern feels like an attack on something they've committed themselves to, even at great cost. The episode follows Quagmire and the others Peter, Joe, as they try to find a way to help Brenda, and what they settle on is murder. They lure Jeff into a remote location, and Quagmire kills him. The show presents this as the resolution of the storyline. Jeff is gone. Brenda is safe. The problem has been solved. The critical response to the episode was sharp and largely negative, and the criticism had a legitimate core. The episode wanted to take domestic violence seriously. You could feel the intention behind it, the desire to do something real with a topic that the show usually deflected through comedy. But taking something seriously and handling it well are different things. The episode's conclusion, where the solution to a woman's abuse is arranged by the men around her without her knowledge or consent, carries uncomfortable implications regardless of the writer's intentions. Brenda is rescued from her situation, but she's rescued in a way that leaves her with no agency in her own story. The men decide what needs to happen, the men make it happen. Brenda is, in the end, a subject of the episode rather than its actor. This is the specific way that Screams of Silence goes wrong, not in caring about the subject, but in failing to center the person at the subject's heart. Brenda never has the moment of choice that genuine stories about leaving abusive relationships recognize as essential. She is acted upon rather than acting. The episode about abuse ends up, inadvertently, organized around the same principle as the abuse itself. Someone else decides what happens to the woman, and the woman's own understanding of her situation is treated as secondary. And yet, the episode lingers. It lingers precisely because it tried clumsily and imperfectly and with significant blind spots to take something real seriously. In a show that spent years making everything into a punchline, Screams of Silence had the decency to look at something without flinching into a joke at the end. That counts for something, even when the execution falls short. The discomfort of watching it is not purely negative. Some of it is the productive discomfort of a story that won't let you off the hook with an easy laugh. Brenda herself, voiced by Caitlin Olsen with a bruised sincerity that the episode's writing doesn't quite match, is the episode's best argument for itself. There is something in Olsen's performance that feels genuinely seen, the specific combination of love and exhaustion and justification that characterizes someone who has spent years making sense of something that doesn't make sense. It's a better performance than the episode deserves, and it suggests what the episode could have been if it had trusted its own intentions more completely. The episode was the subject of significant controversy from media critics and advocacy organizations focused on domestic violence. The criticism centered on the portrayal's exploitation of serious trauma for shock effect rather than genuine insight, and on the resolution's troubling implications. It remains one of the most discussed episodes in the show's history, not because it succeeded but because of the specific, uncomfortable ways it failed. What it also represents is a genuine attempt by the show to do something with the weight of a real subject. The episode is a failure, but it's the kind of failure that comes from ambition rather than laziness. And in a show that was, by season 10, increasingly comfortable with laziness, with the Conway Twitty gag running for a full song, with cutaways stretched to the edge of patience, an ambitious failure is its own kind of notable event. It meant that something in the writer's room was still reaching for something. Section 7. The Road to Nowhere Adventures That Changed Everything. Close your eyes for a moment. Just for a moment. Picture a remote control, not a regular one, but a device Stewie Griffin built in his bedroom between designing a weather manipulation array and cataloging the 17 different ways to defeat the gravitational implications of his playpen. A remote that can do something no regular television remote can do. It can change the channel of reality itself. It can move between universes, slide from one version of the world to another as easily as flipping between cable stations. This is the premise of Road to the Multiverse, Season 8, Episode 1, airing on the 27th of September, 2009. The first episode of the Road to franchise that abandons geography entirely in favor of something more conceptually audacious. The proposition that the world you're in is one of infinitely many, and that the differences between them are both stranger and more revealing than you'd expect. The Road to episodes deserve their own section in any serious accounting of Family Guy's story, because they represent something the show did consistently well even as other things deteriorated around them. They were the episodes built specifically for Brian and Stewie's friendship episodic adventures that gave the show's best relationship room to breathe and develop in ways the regular episode format didn't allow. They began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2, a relatively modest adventure involving Brian picking Stewie up from his grandparents and the two of them getting stranded on the way home. That episode established the template: a journey, a series of complications, character moments that revealed something real about both of them, and a resolution that left their friendship in a slightly different place than it started. What the Road 2 episodes understood that the regular format often didn't was that Stewie and Brian's dynamic was most interesting when neither of them was in their usual context. Pull them out of Spooner Street and put them somewhere genuinely strange, and you got something that felt less like a cartoon about a dysfunctional family and more like an actual story about two very different beings who had chosen each other. Road to Germany, the Season 7 installment from October 2008, is the one that most directly confronts real darkness. Mort Goldman, the town's pharmacist, a recurring Jewish character used mostly for gentle jokes, accidentally steps into Stewie's time machine, believing it to be a bathroom. He ends up in Poland. On the 1st of September, 1939, the day Germany began its invasion, Brian and Stewie go back to retrieve him. What follows is an episode set almost entirely inside the most catastrophic event of the 20th century, and the show handles it with considerably more care than you might expect. The humor is there, there's a brilliant sequence referencing Back to the Future, there's a cameo from the Hawkmen of Flash Gordon in a World War II aerial battle. But the weight of what's happening is not entirely deflected. Mort's Jewish relatives are in genuine danger. The stakes of getting the time machine working and getting out before the invasion fully begins are real. Executive producer David Goodman, who is Jewish himself, read the script and said only slightly facetiously that he was going to get kicked out of his temple. The episode ends with one of the more quietly disturbing moments in the Road 2 canon. After successfully navigating their escape and returning to the present, Stewie calmly kills the version of Mort who traveled with them from the past, shoving him back into the time machine before destroying it, so that the original Mort can remain unaware that any of this happened. It's presented matter-of-factly, a problem to be solved, a loose end to be tied. Stewie doesn't agonize over it. He doesn't frame it as a sacrifice or a tragedy. He simply does it and moves on. That casual relationship with the weight of death, the willingness to dispatch a copy of a person because keeping them around would be inconvenient, is something that the early, fully evil Stewie would have owned completely. By Season 7, it sits a little strangely on the increasingly humanized version of the character. But the episode doesn't linger on the dissonance, it just ends. Road to the Multiverse is where the concept reaches its most conceptually rich point. Stewie's remote takes them through a succession of realities, each one revealing something about the assumptions embedded in the world we consider normal. A world where humans never developed the wheel, and religion became the dominant organizing force of civilization, setting scientific progress back by centuries, and yet, with a pointed joke about the technological advancement in that world, the show acknowledges that the inverse might also be true. A world where Brian's species is the dominant one, and he refuses to leave it because in that world, he gets to be the person rather than the pet. A world rendered in the visual style of a Disney animated film, which produces one of the episode's most purely delightful sequences. A full Disney-style musical number about the simple joy of pie, sung in the manner of something from an old-fashioned animated feature. The Disney Universe sequence has a darkness seated inside it that the episode then develops with unexpected commitment. It is a place of genuine beauty and warmth. And when Stewie's remote breaks and they're briefly stranded there, the possibility of staying, of choosing a world that is literally more beautiful and harmonious than the one they come from, becomes something to take seriously rather than dismiss. The fact that they return home is not treated as obviously correct. The question of why you'd choose the harder world when a better one is accessible is one the episode raises and then leaves, characteristically, without resolving. The Road 2 episodes collectively represent the show's purest expression of what its best creative relationships were capable of. Brian and Stewie, given space and an adventure and the freedom of a format that didn't require them to be supporting players in someone else's chaos, became something genuinely compelling. The friendship between them built slowly over the show's first 3 seasons, deepened through these road trip episodes, tested and strained, and ultimately affirmed through everything that happened to both characters in the later run, is the emotional core of Family Guy in a way that the Griffin family dynamics, for all their canonical primacy, never quite matched. Road to the North Pole, the Season 9 Christmas special from December 2010, takes the road to format and does something very strange and very deliberate with it. Stewie wants to see Santa at the mall. He is given the brush off by the Santa there, and in response, in a decision that is entirely characteristic of Stewie at his most extreme, he resolves to travel to the North Pole and kill Santa Claus personally. What he finds when he gets there is something much more disturbing than anything he was prepared to encounter. The North Pole is not the cheerful winter wonderland of the songs and the commercials. It is a vast industrial nightmare, a factory complex belching toxins into the Arctic sky, operating at capacity far beyond what it was ever designed to sustain. And the people inside it have paid the price. Santa is ancient and exhausted and sick, living on some kind of life support, his eyes glazed with the fixed resignation of someone who has been doing an impossible job for longer than is survivable. The elves, those cheerful, pointy-eared figures from 1,000 Christmas stories, are deformed. The show describes it directly, and Santa describes it directly in the episode's most remarkable speech. They started with one family of elves, and every year the demand for gifts grew, and so the population of elves grew, and the inbreeding required to sustain that growth has resulted in a sickly, mutated race, 60% of whom are born blind, who are worked until their bodies fail and then simply walk out into the snow to die. The reindeer, fed on elf flesh out of desperation, have become feral. They are no longer the magical animals of the stories. They are predators. The song that accompanies this revelation, "Christmas Time is Killing Us," written specifically for the episode, is genuinely good and genuinely mournful. It lists all the things Christmas is supposed to be and then tallies, category by category, what it has actually become. The overconsumption, the expectation, the vast impersonal machinery of giving that has replaced whatever the holiday was originally for. Stewie and Brian, faced with this reality, abandon any thought of killing Santa. They try, instead, to fulfill Christmas by delivering gifts themselves. What follows is one of the show's most committed sequences of sustained black comedy. Brian and Stewie making delivery after delivery, getting progressively worse at it, eventually breaking into a house and tying up the family inside before realizing they had the wrong address. By the end of their round, they have delivered nothing correctly and traumatized several families. The resolution, Brian and Stewie going on television and asking the world to reduce its Christmas demands to one gift per person per year, a request the world agrees to, allowing Santa and the elves to recover, is deliberately fairy tale in its simplicity. The show knows it's a fantasy resolution to a problem it has just established as systemic and structural. But the darkness of the North Pole sequence doesn't fully evaporate. It sits underneath the happy ending, visible if you want to look at it. A reminder that the things we build our mythology around don't always survive contact with the infrastructure required to sustain them. Section 8. The Quagmire Files, the man who said what nobody wanted to hear. Glenn Quagmire is not the character you'd choose to deliver a devastating truth. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most morally compromised figures in the entire show's regular cast. A man whose relationship with women the show has alternately treated as zany and concerning, depending on which era of the series you're watching and how closely you're looking. He has admitted to things in passing throwaway lines that, taken seriously rather than comedically, paint a portrait of someone who should probably be much more frequently in contact with law enforcement than he is. And yet, in Season 8, Episode 7, Jerome is the New Black, Quagmire delivers the single most accurate character assessment in the show's history. And he delivers it about Brian. The context: Cleveland has moved away to Virginia to star in his own spin-off series, and the remaining friends Peter, Joe, Quagmire are trying to fill the void he left. They find Jerome, a charismatic man played with easy confidence, who turns out to have an old connection to Lois from her wilder years. This storyline serves its purpose and moves along. But the other storyline in the episode, the one that people remember, is what happens when Brian discovers that Quagmire hates him. Brian has always assumed that his relationship with Quagmire was simply one of mutual tolerance, the way you tolerate a neighbor whose habits differ from yours, but who shares your street and your social circle. He's mildly aware that he and Quagmire don't have much in common. He's not aware that Quagmire actively despises him. When Brian asks Quagmire directly why at a dinner table, in front of food that goes untouched, in a scene that carries the specific quiet tension of something that has been building for a very long time, Quagmire tells him. The speech goes on for a while. It is extensive and specific, and it references things that have actually happened in previous episodes, which gives it a weight that the show's more episodic arguments don't usually have. Quagmire calls Brian a phony, someone who performs intellectual depth as a social strategy rather than as an expression of anything genuinely developed. He calls out Brian's writing career, which has produced very little of actual merit. He calls out Brian's romantic history, which has involved a string of women pursued and dropped based on surface characteristics, while Brian simultaneously claims to love women for their minds. He calls out Brian's habit of pursuing Lois in front of Peter, who is Brian's best friend and the man who has given Brian a home and food and a life. He calls out Brian's abandoned son, Dylan, a child Brian fathered and then largely left to be raised by others, a fact Brian doesn't like to discuss. He calls out Brian's alcoholism, which the show has treated as a personality quirk but which Quagmire frames as the actual mechanism by which Brian avoids confronting any of this. Then Quagmire delivers the finishing line. He says all of this would be tolerable, all of it, if Brian wasn't also a big, sad alcoholic bore. That's the thing that makes it unbearable. Not the hypocrisy, not the pretension, not the specific terrible choices, the sadness underneath all of it, the emptiness that all the performance is there to conceal. Brian goes home from this dinner speechless. And then Stewie, who has been watching, does something quietly lovely. He tells Brian that the only person whose approval Brian actually needs is himself, and then says, gently, that he admires Brian. It's one of those small moments of grace that the show scattered through its later seasons, proof that whatever else was happening, the writers hadn't entirely forgotten what these characters meant to each other. The complication with Quagmire's speech, and it's a real one, worth sitting with, is that Quagmire is not a reliable narrator. His own history, laid out across the show's run, is extensive and troubling in its own right. He has admitted, in casual throwaway lines and in more focused episodes, to things that go well beyond the quirky womanizer characterization the show has given him. Screams of Silence dealt with his sister Brenda, trapped in an abusive relationship, and Quagmire's response to that situation raised its own questions about consent and agency. The show has at various points acknowledged that Quagmire's behavior around women is closer to predatory than merely inappropriate, and then immediately retreated from that acknowledgement. So, the speech about Brian's failures is delivered by a character who is himself deeply compromised. The audience watching knows both things simultaneously, which makes the speech stranger and more interesting than it would be if Quagmire were purely virtuous. He's not calling Brian out from a position of moral superiority. He's calling him out from a position of transparent self-awareness. Quagmire knows what he is. He admits to it. He says explicitly that he does many of the same things Brian does, but he doesn't pretend otherwise. At least I'm honest about it, he tells Brian. There is something in that distinction that the show found genuinely interesting, even if it didn't fully develop it. The idea that pretension, the performance of virtue rather than its practice, is its own specific category of moral failure, distinct from simply doing bad things. Brian's sin, in Quagmire's accounting, isn't just the bad behavior. It's the accompanying narrative about himself as something better, something more thoughtful and more conscious, that the behavior consistently disproves. Whether you agree with Quagmire's assessment, and there are reasonable arguments on both sides, the speech changed Brian's character in the show's continuity, not because Brian became better afterward. The episode never uses this as a turning point for genuine character growth, but because from that episode forward, the feud between Brian and Quagmire became one of the show's recurring structural elements, a source of tension and occasional drama across many subsequent seasons. And more than that, because the speech named something that was real, it said aloud and on television, in the voice of a character who had no particular reason to be kind about it, that Brian Griffin had become something he was never supposed to be. The show heard that, the audience heard that, and neither one quite knew what to do about it. Section 9, Alternate Universes and Dark Reflections, the multiverse beneath the surface. There is something uniquely unsettling about the concept of an alternate version of yourself. A version of you who made different choices, or who had different choices made for them, and became something unrecognizable as a result. The person you might have been if the traffic light had been green instead of red, if the acceptance letter had arrived or hadn't, if someone had said something different at the right moment, or the wrong one. Family Guy, over its run, has returned again and again to this idea, not always deliberately, not always with thematic consistency, but persistently enough that a pattern emerges. The show is obsessed, in its own sideways way, with what its characters might have become, what they nearly became, what they might still become, in some version of the world that runs parallel to the one the audience watches every week. Road to the Multiverse is the most explicit version of this. Stewie's remote clicking through realities like channels on a cosmic television. But it's far from the only place the show has gone there. The Stewie kills Lois simulation is another version of the same idea. A rehearsal for a reality that doesn't come to pass. A careful exploration of the consequences of a choice before the choice is made. The show has, across its many seasons, developed an informal multiverse that operates in the background of everything, a space where the stakes of the main timeline can be examined through contrast with what might have been otherwise. The most disturbing of the alternate realities glimpsed in Road to the Multiverse is not the most visually extreme. It's the reversed world, the universe where dogs have evolved as the dominant species, and humans occupy the position that dogs do in the show's main reality. Brian, stepping into this world, experiences something the audience is not prepared for. He is greeted as a person. He is treated with dignity and respect. He has a house and a life and a position in society. And the human in this world, a version of what Brian is in his own reality, is a pet kept in a suburban home by a dog family who feeds him and walks him and loves him in the uncomplicated way. You love something that cannot fully understand you. Brian will not leave. Stewie has to drag him out. And in those few moments between Brian's arrival in this world and his reluctant departure, the show captures something it rarely addresses directly: the specific indignity of Brian's position in his own reality. He is a person genuinely, completely, by any reasonable metric who has been given the social and legal status of a pet. He can talk, drive, write novels, discuss philosophy. He pays no taxes and has no citizenship, but he is owned. He sleeps at the foot of Stewie's bed. He requires permission to make decisions about his own life that any functional adult human takes entirely for granted. In the reversed world, that is simply not true. And the ache of that, the specific, wordless grief of seeing what life could feel like if the starting conditions were different, is something the show puts into Brian's face in that moment, with more honesty than almost anything else in the episode. He doesn't want to leave. Of course he doesn't want to leave. He just stepped into the world where he belongs. The multiverse concept, in its later explorations, takes on more explicitly dark tones. Roads to Vegas in Season 11 creates duplicate versions of Brian and Stewie when their teleporter malfunctions, and one pair wins at Vegas while the other loses everything. The episode tracks both timelines simultaneously, and where the show goes with the losing timeline is considerably bleaker than the comedy format would suggest is appropriate. One version of Brian becomes suicidal. One version of Stewie ends up with a weapon pressed against his head by organized crime. The resolution where the lucky versions simply replace the unlucky ones, and no one really acknowledges what happened to the copies, is played as comedy, but it sits wrong. Two versions of people the audience cares about are simply disposed of when their timeline becomes inconvenient, and the narrative treats this as a cleanup rather than a tragedy. This is the underlying horror of the multiverse logic that the show never quite confronts directly. If alternate versions of characters can be created and destroyed at narrative convenience, then the characters themselves are less unique than they seem. Every Brian who has ever been swapped out or replaced or overwritten by a timeline correction is, in some sense, Brian complete with his gun in the safety deposit box and his failed novel and his complicated love for his family. And they are simply gone, without ceremony, because the plot required it. The simulation that ended Stewie kills Lois operates on a related logic. Stewie watched himself commit the worst act he was capable of and observed the consequences, and then chose not to. But the version of Stewie who made those choices in the simulation was real enough to behave like Stewie, to feel what Stewie would feel, to experience what it meant to achieve the thing he'd been working toward, and find it inadequate. That version of Stewie existed, processed something profound, and then ceased to exist when Stewie closed the program. The show has never examined what it means that Stewie watched himself experience his greatest ambition and his greatest defeat in the space of a few hours, then closed the lid and told Brian it didn't work out. The psychological weight of having lived through a simulation that felt real, of having felt, in whatever sense a simulated mind feels things, the satisfaction of killing Lois and the subsequent horror of losing everything is simply not addressed. The twist is clever. The emotional aftermath of the twist is left entirely unexplored. And perhaps that's characteristic. The show built, over its run, a kind of mythology of the Griffin family that it never fully sat with. A history of dark moments of deaths and resurrections and alternate timelines and simulated tragedies that accumulated without being integrated. The mythology exists. It's there, in the episodes, in the record. But the show never quite built the structure of thought that would let these pieces of the story mean something in relation to each other. The multiverse beneath the surface of Family Guy is the show's most interesting ghost. All those other versions of these people, living out their alternate lives in their branching timelines, the Stewie who did kill Lois and rule the world and lost everything, the Brian who stayed in the reversed world and lived as a person, the family that Meg stood up to and left, the one where her speech changed something instead of being taken back. These are the lives the show glimpsed and turned away from. These are the stories it almost told. Section 10. The Cutaway Universe. What lives between the jokes? There is a kind of joke that requires almost no setup. You point at something absurd and you hold the camera there, and the absurdity itself does the work. Family Guy built an entire empire on this principle. The cutaway gag, that structural feature that made the show famous and eventually defined it more than any of its characters, is at its core the simplest possible comic transaction. Here is something strange. Look at it. Laugh at it. And now we return you to your regularly scheduled programming. But within that simplicity, across hundreds of episodes and thousands of cutaways, something accumulated. A body of material. A loose, unofficial mythology. A record of every strange and dark and occasionally genuinely disturbing place the show's writers were willing to point the camera before cutting away. The cutaway universe is not a coherent place. That's part of its nature. It's a space of pure associative logic, where anything can follow anything if the verbal setup is right. Peter mentions something, and we're suddenly somewhere else, entirely a different era, a different country, a different register of reality. The jokes that work best in this format are the ones where the gap between the setup and the cutaway is at its widest. The greater the distance between the word that sent you there and the scene you're now watching, the more the comedy accumulates in the crossing. At its best, this is genuinely smart comedy. The early season's cutaways were often constructed with a kind of architectural precision, the setup line pointing in one direction while the cutaway went somewhere unexpected, the humor living in the gap between where you thought you were headed and where you ended up. The show at its most inventive was using the cutaway not as a lazy replacement for storytelling, but as a kind of accelerated surrealism, a way of moving between ideas at a speed that linear narrative can't match. At its worst, and the show spent considerable time in this territory in its middle and later seasons, the cutaway is simply time-filling. A gag that doesn't relate to anything, placed where something more meaningful might have been, present not because it adds something, but because it occupies space that would otherwise need to be filled with actual character work or plot development. The Conway Twitty running bit, where the show would cut to a full performance of a country song by the late Conway Twitty in its entirety, with no punchline, is the most notorious example of this. A cutaway so deliberately devoid of comedic content that it looped around into being a statement about the show's own relationship with its audience. "We are not giving you anything," the Conway Twitty gag says. "We are aware that you are watching. We have chosen not to do anything with your attention." But between the brilliant early cutaways and the deliberately empty later ones, there is a vast middle territory of material that is darker and stranger than either extreme. The cutaways that stick, the ones people quote and share and remember years later, are often the ones that went somewhere the show's regular format wouldn't allow. The ones that touch something genuinely uncomfortable and then cut away before the discomfort could fully develop into a feeling that needed to be processed. The darkest cutaways in the show's run are not the most graphic ones. They are the ones with an emotional dimension that the format refuses to develop. A glimpse of a version of Brian or Peter or Lois that suggests a history or a feeling that the main narrative has never made space for. A moment of genuine darkness, a real admission, a real wound that the show uses as a punchline and immediately leaves. There is a cutaway in Season 7's Baby Not On Board episode where Peter references being more useless than Aquaman, and the resulting gag is harmless enough. But what the episode is actually doing around that moment, leaving Stewie alone at home, an infant, entirely without adult supervision, for an extended period of time, carries an undercurrent of genuine childhood vulnerability that the show treats as comedy, but that reads differently if you let it. Stewie's ingenuity in caring for himself while the family is away is played as a showcase for his precocious competence. It is also a story about a baby who has been forgotten by the people responsible for him. The show's handling of Stewie's inner life in general traces this pattern. The evil genius exterior is the surface the cutaways and the main plots interact with. What lives underneath it glimpsed in the bank vault episode, glimpsed in his desperation to bring Brian back after the death in season 12. Glimpsed in the quieter moments of the Road 2 episodes is a child who is, for all his remarkable capabilities, fundamentally alone in his own home. The adults around him can't hear him. The only person who truly understands him is a dog who was, for 3 weeks in November 2013, dead. The Cutaway universe reflects this loneliness without acknowledging it. It is a space of constant movement and constant noise, a place where nothing stays long enough to be examined. The humor lives in the transit, in the gap between setups and punchlines, in the perpetual motion of an associative logic that never rests long enough to feel anything completely. And in that sense, the Cutaway universe is the truest map of what Family Guy ultimately became, a show that had learned to move fast enough that the feelings underneath never quite caught up. Section 11. The Griffins in Winter, what the later seasons quietly revealed. There is a Family Guy that exists in the spaces between the jokes. Between the cutaways and the shock value and the reset buttons, something accumulated over the show's long run that the writers may not have entirely intended. A portrait of a family in a kind of slow, quiet decline. Not the comedic decline of the fictional Griffins, who remain in their fictional house on their fictional street regardless of what the ratings say. A deeper decline. The decline of what it meant to spend time with them. In the early seasons, the Griffin home felt like a place. It had a texture to it, the specific clutter of a working-class house where 5 people and a dog and a baby lived their daily lives. The refrigerator was full of food that Lois had made. The couch had a specific relationship with Peter's body that had been established over years of the same position. The backyard was the site of events that the neighbors commented on. The house was a home, and homes have a weight that comes from having been inhabited honestly. In the later seasons, the Griffin home became more like a stage set. The furniture was the same, but the life in it had thinned. Peter and Lois's marriage, once the show's most reliable source of genuine warmth, the thing that could be counted on to close episodes with something resembling resolution, had become a relationship characterized more by mutual tolerance than love. Lois had become sharper-edged, colder, quicker to contempt. Peter had drifted so far from the person who had loved his wife and imperfectly tried to protect his children that the marriage they were in looked nothing like the one that opened the show. The children drifted similarly. Chris, who had always been the most unremarked upon of the Griffin kids, became increasingly peripheral as the seasons progressed, used when a plot required him, absent when it didn't. His personality never quite developed beyond a few recurring traits. Meg's story has already been told here at length. Stewie's transformation from the most original character on the show to a softer, more conventional version of himself represents its own kind of loss. What the later seasons revealed, when you watch them with some distance, is that the writers had run out of things to say with these people. Not jokes, there were always more jokes, an endless capacity for gags and references and cutaways, but things to say, genuine insights about who these characters were and what they meant to each other. The relationship between Peter and Lois in Season 1 had specific texture. His fumbling attempts to be the husband she deserved, her patient and sometimes exasperated love for a man who constantly fell short. By Season 16, whatever version of that relationship remained was simply going through motions that the show required. The dark storylines in the later seasons, the ones that tried to import genuine emotional weight into the format, often felt exactly like what they were. Attempts to recover something the show had lost rather than extensions of something it still had. The Peter's Sister episode, the Brian and Stewie Bank Vault episode, the Road to the North Pole, these are the moments the later show produced that feel real. And what they have in common is that they all, in different ways, peel back the surface of the regular format and look at something the show usually runs past too quickly to examine. Brian and Stewie is the most extreme version of this. Remove the cutaway gags and the secondary characters and the usual pace, and what you're left with is 2 characters in a room who actually love each other and have a genuinely complicated history, and enough silence to finally say what's true. The episode exists as an argument against the show's own dominant format proof that slowing down reveals things that speed conceals. The Griffin family in Winter is not a tragic story. It's something more complicated than tragedy. It's a story about the distance between what a thing was and what it became, between the warmth that was once genuinely present and the habit that eventually replaced it. The house is still there. The characters are still there. The voices haven't changed. But somewhere in the long middle of the show's run, the life that those characters lived together became thinner, And the show that was built around them became a showcase for something other than the people it was named after. The darkness in Family Guy's later seasons isn't usually the kind of darkness that announces itself. It's quieter than that. It's the darkness of things not being there anymore. Of a family going through the motions of family without the feeling that used to give those motions meaning. Of a show that understood, somewhere in its institutional memory, that it had been better, but couldn't quite find its way back to what better had felt like. Section 12. The endings that never stayed, and the show that kept going. There is a particular kind of melancholy that comes from watching something you love refuse to stop. Family Guy never chose an ending. It was always going to keep going one more season, one more deal, one more renewal from a network that found the economics favorable regardless of what the creative quality suggested. The show was announced in 2025 as renewed through season 27, which will take it to the 2028 to 2029 television season. Its 30th anniversary, a milestone that would have seemed impossible in 2002 when Fox canceled it for the second time and nobody expected it to return. The show that exists in those seasons, the one watched by fewer than 1 million people on a Wednesday night, moved from the Sunday lineup that had been its home for most of its life, is still Family Guy. The voices are the same, the house is the same, the format is the same, and yet something happened over those 30 years that the renewal deals and the streaming revenue and the merchandise couldn't address. The show that started in 1999 as something genuinely alive and genuinely strange became, over the decades, something that continued largely because continuation was what it did. The endings that should have come didn't. Not just Brian's death, reversed before the grief could mean anything. Not just the simulation that let Stewie achieve everything he wanted and then took it away before it could cost anything. All of it, every moment where the show gestured at something irreversible and then reversed it, every reconciliation that evaporated before the next episode, every character arc that completed itself and then reset, all of it added up to a show that had developed a very particular relationship with consequence. It could mime consequence with considerable skill, but it couldn't actually allow it. Christmas Guy brings Brian back, the simulation ends, Meg takes back her speech. The Mort who traveled through time is quietly dispatched so that the original Mort can remain unaware. The alternate Brians and Stewies of the Vegas timelines are resolved without ceremony. Everything returns. The house on Spooner Street persists. And yet the stories remain, even the undone ones. Even the ones that reset and the ones that were simulations, and the ones where the death turned out to be reversible. The story of Brian dying on a street corner while Stewie was inside getting his knee pads, that story exists, regardless of what Stewie did with a time machine 2 episodes later. The story of Stewie watching himself finally do the thing he'd been planning since before he could walk, and finding it worse than staying home, that story exists. The story of Meg standing in a hurricane-battered house and telling her family the truth about what they had done to her, and then taking it back, that story exists. They exist in the episodes, in the record of the show, in the memories of the people who watched them. The show's refusal to let them mean anything permanently doesn't unmake them. It just makes them sadder. Stories that could have changed things, that gestured at change, that briefly held out the possibility that these characters might actually become something different, and then closed the door quietly and went back to what was there before. The house on Spooner Street keeps the lights on. The Griffin family keeps having its dinners and its fights and its cutaways. Brian keeps drinking his martinis. Stewie keeps being Stewie, whichever version of Stewie the current season requires. Peter keeps doing what Peter does now, which is less and less the thing Peter used to do in the seasons when the show was discovering itself. And somewhere in the background, in the record of what the show attempted and occasionally achieved and more often walked away from, there is the Family Guy that might have been. The one where Brian's death meant something beyond a ratings bump, where Stewie's simulation left a mark on his character that the following seasons acknowledged, where Meg's confrontation with her family wasn't taken back before the credits rolled, where Peter's moment of recognition in Peter's sister changed the dynamic that it had correctly identified as damaging. That show exists in the same multiverse as the reversed world where Brian gets to be a person, and the North Pole where the elves who walked into the snow to die were saved before the damage became permanent, and the timeline where Stewie keeps the version of his friend that didn't get hit by a car. It's there. It's accessible if you point the remote in the right direction. Maybe that's enough. Maybe a story doesn't have to be allowed its consequences in order to have told them. Maybe the fact that the simulation showed Stewie something true Even though he closed the program and told Brian it didn't work out, means that Stewie saw it, that it happened. That somewhere in the infinite branching of all the roads these characters could have taken, there is a path where every one of these moments was allowed to mean what it meant. The lights are low, the street outside is quiet. Spooner Street is still there somewhere in the distance of imagination. The Griffin house lit from within by the blue glow of a television that's always on. They're still in there, all of them louder and stranger and sometimes darker than they were when we first met them, but still there. Close your eyes, let them have their house, let the road go wherever it goes. We'll be back next time with more of the stories that live underneath the punchlines. More of the darkness that the show couldn't quite bring itself to fully illuminate. More of the moments that almost changed everything, and almost didn't, and landed somewhere in between, which is, when you think about it, exactly where most moments land. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person this channel was made for, and I'm genuinely glad you're here. Drop a like if you fell asleep at some point and woke up to find the video still going. That's the goal. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the button is right there, and it costs you nothing except the 30 seconds it takes to press it. These videos take a long time to make, and every subscriber is proof that it's worth it. Stay cozy, stay weird, and I'll see you in the next one. End of script. Bonus section. A. The Giant Chicken and the Mythology of Meaningless Violence. There is a recurring element in Family Guy that, when you think about it for longer than the show invites you to, says something surprisingly honest about how the show understands violence. His name in the show's mythology is Ernie the Giant Chicken. He is, literally, a giant chicken, a rooster the size of a man, dressed in a shirt, with whom Peter Griffin has been conducting an ongoing feud that has periodically erupted into cataclysmic physical confrontations across the show's entire run. The first time they fight is in Season 2, Episode 5, an episode called Da Boom. The backstory, revealed in a later episode, is almost heartbreakingly petty. Ernie gave Peter a coupon that turned out to be expired, and Peter refused to let it go. Encouraging that's the entire foundation of what became one of the show's most elaborate and technically impressive recurring bits. A coupon dispute. An expired piece of paper. Two beings willing to cause enormous amounts of destruction over a slight that was either never intentional or was resolved so long ago that neither party can fully remember why they're still fighting. The chicken fights that follow, and there are at least 6 major ones across the show's run, occurring in Seasons 2, 4, 7, 8, 12, and beyond, are genuinely impressive pieces of animation. They're extended, meticulously choreographed sequences of escalating destruction, styled after action movie set pieces more than cartoon slapstick. Peter and Ernie punch each other through walls. They fall from great heights. They destroy environments that you would normally expect to be permanent buildings, vehicles. Entire city blocks become collateral damage in the ongoing war between a man and a chicken over a coupon that has long since ceased to matter to either of them. The humor of the chicken fights lives entirely in their disproportionality. The response is insane relative to the provocation. The violence is spectacular relative to the stakes. This is not complicated comedy, it's the oldest joke in physical comedy, scaled up to movie-budget animation levels and given a recurring cast member instead of a one-off fall guy. But what the chicken fights gradually revealed about the show's relationship with violence is something worth sitting with. Because as the seasons progressed, the gap between the chicken fight violence and the show's other violence, the Peter hurts his knee gag that goes on for 45 seconds, the increasingly graphic injury sequences involving characters the audience was supposed to care about, became harder to maintain. The chicken fights work because their violence is abstract. Ernie the Giant Chicken is not a character we're invested in as a person. The destruction of property in these sequences doesn't involve anyone we care about being hurt in ways that feel real. But when the same energy, the spectacular, extended, detailed violence was applied to scenes involving Meg, or Brian, or Joe, it stopped being the fun kind of absurdity. The show was using the same animating principle: consequences don't matter, recovery is instantaneous. Pain is a performance in contexts where that principle undermined the audience's ability to care about what was happening to the characters. The chicken fights are, in retrospect, the show's most honest metaphor for itself. Two figures locked in perpetual conflict over a slight that lost its original meaning long ago, causing enormous damage in a show of spectacular commitment to a point that nobody quite remembers making anymore. They just keep fighting. The fight itself has become the reason. Bonus Section B. Stewie's origin story and the dark child underneath. There is a moment in the very first episode of Family Guy. The pilot aired the 31st of January 1999, which pulled 22 million viewers because it aired after the Super Bowl, where Stewie Griffin sits in his high chair, regards the world around him with an expression that communicates absolute contempt for every person in his immediate vicinity, and delivers a speech about his plans for world domination to an audience that cannot hear him. He is 1 year old. He has been alive for 12 months. He speaks in the polished, deliberate cadences of someone who graduated from Cambridge in the 30s. He says with complete calm that he has cataloged his mother's weaknesses and that the window for action is narrowing. Everything that made Stewie Griffin the show's most original creation is present in that moment. The incongruity, the gap between the physical reality baby, high chair, bib, pureed carrots, and the interior reality, which is the elaborate, organized, genuinely threatening mind of someone who means every word he says. The fact that no one in the room can hear him except the audience creates an instant intimacy between Stewie and the viewer that none of the other characters had. He was ours. He was talking to us, not to them. The question of how Stewie became what he was, how a 1-year-old child developed not just language, but this specific variety of language, this specific orientation toward the world, is one that the show deliberately left unanswered for most of its run. His intelligence is presented as simply a fact, the way a lot of things in the show's reality are simply facts. Brian talks. Cleveland's bathtub periodically falls through his house and into the yard. Stewie is an evil genius. These things are true in this world. They require no further explanation. But across the early seasons, in the accumulation of small details and background moments, a portrait emerges of how Stewie got to be this way. And that portrait is, when you assemble the pieces, genuinely dark. Stewie Griffin is not simply a prodigy who happened to be born into an ordinary family. He is a prodigy in a family that cannot hear him. That distinction matters enormously. The defining feature of Stewie's early existence is not his intelligence, it's the invisibility of that intelligence to every person in his life except Brian. He can build a ray gun and no one will notice. He can plot the overthrow of every government on Earth and his mother will walk in, smile, pick him up, and tell him it's time for his bath. He exists in a state of radical, permanent non-recognition. This is a kind of loneliness that the show used mostly for comedy. The joke is the gap between Stewie's self-perception and the world's perception of him. The joke is that the most dangerous person in the room is invisible to everyone in it. And it is funny. It produces some of the show's most memorable comedy. But it is also, if you let yourself sit with it, something that reads less like a punchline and more like a description of a particular kind of childhood experience. The experience of being someone that the adults around you cannot see. The world domination plans are, in this reading, not simply the quirks of a cartoon villain. They are the interior life of a child who has concluded that if the world will not acknowledge him, he will simply make itself impossible to ignore. The ray guns and the mind control devices are the fantasies of someone who has found that the normal routes to recognition, speaking, expressing needs, trying to communicate, are functionally closed. So he builds larger and larger machinery for making himself seen. Brian's role in Stewie's life, in the early seasons, becomes more poignant under this lens. Brian is the only character who can hear Stewie's actual voice, who registers what Stewie is actually saying, rather than the garbled infant noise the adults perceive. Brian is, in the most literal sense, the only person in Stewie's world who knows him, who sees him. Their friendship is built on the foundation of recognition, of one being seeing another clearly enough to respond to what's actually there, rather than what the conventional social categories would suggest should be there. As Stewie changed across the seasons as the evil genius receded and the more emotional, vulnerable character emerged, this foundation remained even when almost everything else shifted. The Stewie who chased Brian down across timelines after his death in Season 12 was not the Stewie of Season 1. But the reason he ran the specific fear of losing the only person who had always, from the beginning, been able to hear him was entirely continuous with that original, lonelier version of the character. The child who built ray guns because speaking wasn't working had become a child who would alter the timeline itself rather than live in a world where the only one who listened was gone. That's a love story of a sort. A strange one, trapped inside a cartoon about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family, but a love story nonetheless. Bonus Section C, The Missing Years. What Happened to Cleveland Brown? There is something deeply odd about the way Family Guy has handled the absence of Cleveland Brown. He was there from the beginning, one of Peter's four core friends. A gentle man defined by a patient kind of dignity that made him the emotional anchor of that group, the one whose measured responses to Peter's chaos provided a reliable counterpoint to the other extremes in the room. For 8 seasons, Cleveland Brown was simply there, on the corner bar stool at the Drunken Clam, doing what Cleveland did, listening, responding with measured good humor, occasionally having his bathtub fall through the floor of his house, in what became one of the show's most reliable recurring physical gags. Then, in 2009, Cleveland departed. He moved to Virginia, he took his ex-wife's family and built a new life in a new city. And a new show, The Cleveland Show, followed him there for 4 seasons on Fox before being canceled in 2013. And then Cleveland came back. He returned to Spooner Street for season 13 of Family Guy onward, having apparently decided that Virginia hadn't worked out as expected. The Cleveland who returned was, in some ways, a different character from the Cleveland who left. 4 years of his own show, his own storylines, his own growth, all of that existed in the background of his return, acknowledged in broad strokes but not fully integrated. He was back, which was good. The group dynamic had never quite stabilized without him. But the specific texture of who Cleveland had become in the intervening years, what he had lost and found and decided during his time away, lived mostly in the mythology of a canceled show rather than in the episodes of the one he'd returned to. His absence during those middle seasons was felt in ways the show didn't fully acknowledge. The friendship group that remained Peter, Quagmire, Joe had a different energy without Cleveland's particular brand of patience. Quagmire and Brian's feud filled some of the space that Cleveland's presence had previously occupied, but it filled it with tension rather than warmth, with antagonism rather than the kind of steady, uncomplicated loyalty that Cleveland had provided. The episode Life of Brian, in which Brian dies, features a small but meaningful detail. Cleveland attends Brian's funeral. He travels all the way back from Virginia with his new wife Donna to be there. He doesn't speak. He's simply present there to say goodbye to the dog who was his neighbor for 8 years, to honor the loss in the way that loss should be honored when you genuinely cared about the person who is gone. It's a quiet moment, and the show doesn't make a big deal of it, but it says something true about Cleveland Brown that the show could sometimes lose track of in the noise of everything else. He was a person who showed up, even when showing up was inconvenient, even when the reasons for showing up were sad. Cleveland's return brought with it one of the later show's more honest character relationships, his marriage to Donna, which depicted something the show's marriages often didn't. 2 adults who genuinely loved each other and occasionally drove each other genuinely crazy in ways that felt grounded in actual human relationship dynamics, rather than the exaggerated dysfunction that powered the Griffin marriage in its later years. But the Cleveland storylines in the post-return seasons never quite found the same weight that his original presence had. He was there again. He was his friends again. He was on the bar stool at the Drunken Clam again. But the show around him had changed enough that the specific kind of warmth Cleveland had generated, patient, steady, a counterweight to everything excessive about the world he inhabited, was harder to land in an environment where excess had become the default setting. He was the same character in a slightly different world, and the difference showed in small, indefinable ways. Bonus Section D. The show within the show when Family Guy looked in the mirror. There is a recurring feature of Family Guy's middle and later seasons that criticism has both celebrated and condemned: the show's habit of looking directly at itself, of having its characters acknowledge that they are in a television show, of making jokes about its own declining quality, its own ratings, its own relationship with Fox, its own storytelling habits, of breaking what fiction conventionally calls the fourth wall, the invisible barrier between the story and the audience, watching it and using that breakage as a comedic resource. At its most clever, this self-awareness is genuinely funny. The show at its best had always been aware of its own absurdity, willing to wink at the audience about the conventions it was using even as it used them. The early cutaways had a quality of playful transparency. They felt like the show saying, "Yes, we know this is a trick. Here's the trick. Isn't it a good one?" That self-awareness, when it lived in the craft of the jokes themselves rather than in explicit meta-commentary, worked beautifully. At its least clever, the self-awareness became a substitute for improvement. The show discovered that it could generate a certain kind of knowing laughter by having characters directly comment on the show's quality. Peter breaking the fourth wall to express frustration with the writing, characters making jokes about the network, episodes dedicated to examining the show's own mechanics as entertainment. And there was always laughter. The audience appreciated being recognized. They appreciated the show's acknowledgement that they had noticed what they had noticed. But there is a meaningful difference between a show that examines its own flaws as a step toward addressing them, and a show that examines its own flaws as a way of not having to. The latter is the mode the show fell into during its extended middle period. The jokes about the writing room replacing the work of improving the writing room. The meta-commentary about the show running too long, substituting for the harder question of whether the show should address why it felt like it was running too long. Back to the pilot. The Season 10 episode where Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the show's very first episode is the clearest example of this. It's a genuinely inventive premise, the idea of the characters visiting the version of themselves from 11 years earlier, seeing the original setting and the original animation style, and the original texture of the show. And it produces some genuinely funny observations. The characters notice that the animation style is different. They notice that the pacing is different. Stewie and Brian from 2011 watch Stewie and Brian from 1999, and the gap between those two versions of the characters is visible and interesting. But the episode doesn't do anything with what it notices. It observes the difference without accounting for it, acknowledges the distance between then and now, without examining what created that distance. The show looks in the mirror and laughs at what it sees, but doesn't do anything with the reflection except use it as material for another episode. Cutaway Land, the episode built specifically around the show's most famous feature, follows the same pattern. Peter and Lois can travel between cutaways, literally inhabiting the space of the show's most signature comic device. It's a clever conceit, and then the episode uses recycled cutaways from earlier seasons, and ends with Peter waking up and realizing it was a dream. One of the oldest and most tired narrative tricks available, and the whole thing reveals itself as the thing it was trying to comment on. A show filling time with references to its own past rather than creating something new. The show within the show is, ultimately, a story about a creative work that developed an increasingly complicated relationship with its own history. The early seasons produced the gold standard against which everything else was measured, and the show spent its later years in a kind of constant negotiation with that history, sometimes trying to recover it, sometimes mocking the impossibility of recovery, sometimes simply making jokes about the fact of the gap rather than attempting to close it. What the self-awareness never quite produced was the one thing that would have made it meaningful: change. A show that could look at itself clearly and laugh at what it saw, but couldn't quite find a way to become something different from what it had been laughing at. Bonus Section E. The Neighborhood Joe, Quagmire, and what neighbors reveal about each other. Peter Griffin's neighborhood tells a story that the show within it sometimes forgot to tell. The houses on Spooner Street, the Griffin house, the Swansons next door, Quagmire on the other side. Cleveland's old place were the setting for a specific kind of male friendship that the show depicted with genuine warmth in its early seasons, and with something more complicated as the years went on. Joe Swanson arrived in Season 1's 7th episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, as exactly what the episode's title describes: the hero, the guy everyone admired. Peter's initial response to Joe was jealousy, the specific, uncomfortable jealousy of a man who sees in his neighbor something he had thought he was doing adequately and now recognizes he had been doing poorly. Joe was good-looking and capable and respected, and he was in a wheelchair, and none of that diminished him. If anything, his disability made his achievements more visible, more remarkable, more worthy of the admiration that made Peter's jealousy so sharp. That initial dynamic, Peter slightly awed by his neighbor, wanting his approval, occasionally competing with him in ways that highlighted Peter's limitations rather than Joe's, was exactly the right starting point for a friendship. It gave their relationship texture. There was a real power dynamic in their earliest interactions, one that shifted over time in ways that felt organic and interesting. But as Peter became more extreme, more cruel, more openly contemptuous of the people around him, the friendship with Joe changed in ways that mirrored the larger changes in Peter's character. Joe stopped being the object of Peter's admiration and became, increasingly, the target of his mockery. The disability that had never diminished Joe's competence in the show's early framing became the reliable subject of jokes that required the audience to find Joe's wheelchair funny rather than incidental. The man who had been the most capable person on the street was gradually reduced to a version of himself that the show used primarily as a source of material about physical limitation, This is the specific failure of flanderization as applied to supporting characters. It doesn't just change who they are, it changes what they mean to the characters around them. Joe was evidence, in Season 1, that capability and dignity were independent of physical ability. In the later seasons, he was evidence that a long-running show can flatten any character into a smaller version of their original self, regardless of how much more interesting the larger version had been. Quagmire's trajectory is different and, in some ways, more troubling. His defining characteristic in the early seasons was his appetites, specifically his sexual appetite, which the show handled with a combination of cartoonish exaggeration and the kind of comfortable winking that allowed audiences to laugh at behavior that, taken seriously, would be deeply concerning. Quagmire dated women enthusiastically, energetically, and in numbers that the show found inherently comedic. The show's early treatment of this kept it firmly in the territory of caricature. Quagmire as a walking, talking representation of a particular type of male social aspiration, his excesses so exaggerated that they maintained a kind of ironic distance from anything that felt real. As the show's treatment of content became more direct and less defended by irony, the Quagmire material got harder to navigate. Screams of silence confronted, seriously and uncomfortably, the implications of what his character had always implied. Other episodes let him admit to things in casual throwaway lines that went considerably beyond enthusiastic dating. The show never quite decided whether Quagmire was a cartoonishly exaggerated symbol of a certain kind of masculine excess, a straight-ahead critique of that excess, or silly a character whose worst traits were being played for comedy without the show taking a position on whether those traits were funny. The famous speech against Brian in Jerome is the New Black is interesting partly because of the light it shines on Quagmire from a different angle. In that speech, Quagmire is perceptive, articulate, and in command of a genuine psychological insight. He sees Brian clearly in a way that the other characters don't. And the contrast between this Quagmire observant, morally aware enough to identify hypocrisy when he sees it, and the Quagmire who has admitted to considerably worse things than Brian's pretension, makes the speech strange and layered in ways the show may not have fully intended. He is the character who sees the fraud in others because he recognizes it. He knows what it looks like to perform better than you are, because he has been performing something different for most of his life. The neighborhood has always been, in the best version of the show's storytelling, a cast of characters who illuminate each other. What the men of Spooner Street reveal about each other in the bar, in their side-by-side yards, in the accumulated history of their years of adjacent living, is something the show began with a genuine instinct for, and gradually let drift into simpler, flatter patterns. The neighborhood in Season 1 felt like a specific place with specific people who had specific histories with each other. The neighborhood in later seasons felt more like a stage set where recurring characters happened to return to each other's vicinity. But the original insight that people reveal themselves through the company they keep, that a neighborhood is a kind of enforced intimacy that shows you things about your own assumptions, that insight never entirely disappeared. It shows up in the best episodes of the later seasons, when the show remembered that it had built something here worth remembering. Bonus Section F, Lois Griffin and the Slow Erosion of the Center. Every family story needs a center. Someone whose judgment, whose patience, whose capacity to see clearly through the noise of everyone else's extremes gives the whole enterprise a reference point. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, that person was Lois Griffin, and the story of what happened to Lois across the show's long run is, in its own quiet way, as dark as anything that happened to Peter or Meg or Brian. Lois Griffin in Season 1 was drawn with a specificity that the show's promotional materials never quite captured. She was not simply the long-suffering wife in the generic sitcom sense, though that's the category she superficially inhabited. She was a woman with a specific history, the daughter of a wealthy and emotionally distant family, who had married Peter in what everyone around her had probably considered a poor decision, and who had built something genuinely good out of that decision, through a combination of fierce love and practical competence that she rarely received credit for because it was so constant as to be invisible. Her marriage to Peter was not simply comic material in the early seasons. It was a real relationship, drawn with enough specificity that you could feel the history in it, the fights they'd had before and the ones they'd since made up from, the particular way they moved around each other in the kitchen, the way Peter's face changed when Lois walked into the room even after years of marriage. There was something in the early Lois and Peter dynamic that the show used as an anchor. However chaotic everything else got, they came home to each other. They had dinner together and went to bed together and woke up together, and the relationship held. The early episodes gave Lois real characterization beyond her role as mother and wife. She had a piano, and she played it, and she was good. She had a complicated relationship with her parents, the Pewterschmidts, wealthy and disapproving, that gave her a context outside the Griffin family. She had her own history of rebellion, her own secrets. The show later revealed a considerable wild child past that lived in uncomfortable tension with her present-day maternal persona, her own specific way of navigating a world that had mostly tried to fit her into a shape that didn't quite match who she actually was. As the show progressed and Peter's character drifted into something darker and less sympathetic, Lois should arguably have become more central, more important, the counterweight to his excesses, the moral center of a household that was losing its ethical bearings. Instead, something different happened. Lois's character drifted in a direction that made her less of a counterweight and more of a participant. She became sharper, more dismissive, more willing to engage in the family's collective mistreatment of Meg, rather than resisting it. The patience that had been one of her defining qualities thinned out. The warmth that had made her someone to root for became intermittent. Part of this was, in fairness, the inevitable result of living with a Peter Griffin whose character had undergone the specific transformations outlined elsewhere in this script. The Lois of Season 14 has been putting up with a version of Peter that the Lois of Season 1 never knew, a version who had become more extreme, more reckless, more genuinely indifferent to consequences that affected other people. A certain erosion of warmth in response to years of that company is at least psychologically plausible. But the show didn't treat Lois's change as a consequence of Peter's deterioration. It treated it as a new set of character traits, something to be used for comedy when needed, set aside when it wasn't. The same reset button that affected every other character applied to Lois as well. When the episode required the warm, patient mother from Season 1, she was available. When it required a sharper, cooler, more detached Lois, she was available for that too. The consistency that had made her feel like a person gave way to the flexibility that made her useful as a plot device. There is an episode in the show's middle run, Lois Kills Stewie. Technically, though, the events are in a simulation where Lois confronts Stewie after his world domination scheme, and the resulting battle between them is one of the show's most dramatically compelling sequences. This Lois, resourceful, fierce, more capable than anyone had given her credit for, willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect her family, is the Lois that the original characterization was pointing toward. She is not simply the patient housewife. She is someone who has been patient because the situation has called for patience, but who contains reserves of something much more formidable. That Lois appeared in a simulation, and then the simulation ended, and the Lois of the main timeline went back to being what the current season required of her. Perhaps the most honest thing you can say about Lois Griffin's arc over the show's run is that she was the character most harmed by the surrounding changes. She had been the anchor. When Peter's character drifted to the point where the anchor was no longer sufficient to hold him, the anchor didn't hold him, it just sat there, doing its job. In water that was moving faster than it was designed to manage, she stayed. The rest of the show moved, and the gap between where she was and where everything else had gone became its own kind of loss. Bonus Section G. The sound of the show music, tone, and what changed when no one was looking. There is a dimension of Family Guy's decline that gets discussed less often than the character changes or the writing quality or the ratings drop, and that dimension is sonic, how the show sounds. The specific texture of its music, its pacing, its use of silence and noise, and how those elements changed across the seasons in ways that are easy to feel without quite being able to name. The early seasons of Family Guy had a musical identity that was genuinely distinctive. Walter Murphy composed the show's original score, and his work in those first 3 seasons brought something unusual to an animated comedy, a jazz-inflected, slightly melancholy musical palette that gave the show a sonic texture no other cartoon had. The incidental music that underscored Peter's misadventures and Brian's loneliness and the Griffin family's chaotic domestic life had a warmth to it that was easy to underestimate because it operated mostly below the level of conscious attention. You didn't notice the music making you feel something until you watched an early episode back-to-back with a later one and realized that the later one felt different in a way you couldn't immediately explain. The signature theme, the multi-part vocal arrangement that accompanied the opening credits, established something from the beginning. This was a show that thought it was musical, that took its own soundtrack seriously. The theme had a Broadway quality to it, a theatrical confidence, a sense that the show understood itself as entertainment in the old-fashioned, fully committed sense. It was the sound of a show that wanted you to feel welcomed, specifically, warmly, by the decision to spend time with it. That sonic confidence carried through the show's musical episodes and musical moments, the songs that appeared in regular episodes, the special episodes built entirely around musical performance, the Road to episodes which consistently incorporated original music as a core element of their storytelling. Road to the North Pole produced Christmas Time Is Killing Us, which is a genuinely good song by any standard, a dark holiday comedy piece that works both as humor and as something more genuinely melancholy. Road to the Multiverse produced It's a Wonderful Day for Pi, a loving parody of old Disney musical numbers that captured its target with enough accuracy and affection to work on both levels. Simultaneously, the show could do music. It had always been able to do music, and in its best episodes, music was one of the primary ways it expressed things the dialogue didn't quite say directly. What happened to the sound of the show as the seasons progressed is harder to pin down precisely, but something shifted. The musical identity became less distinctive. The incidental score became more generic, more interchangeable with the background music of any other animated comedy. The specific warmth that Murphy's original compositions had brought to the show, that slightly melancholy jazz quality, gave way to something more functional and less distinctive. The pacing changed too, and pacing is a sonic experience as much as a visual one. The early episodes had a rhythm to them, the way jokes landed, the timing between setups and punchlines, the specific beat of silence before a delivery that let the comedy breathe. As the show added more cutaways, the pacing accelerated in ways that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. The best cutaway-heavy episodes used the rapid pace as a feature. The jokes accumulated so quickly that the comedy became its own kind of momentum, carrying you forward before you had time to analyze what you just laughed at. The weaker episodes used the pace as cover, moving fast enough that the gaps where good jokes should have been passed before you could notice them. The one episode that stripped away all of this, Brian and Stewie, with no cutaways and no music, stands out in the show's sonic history precisely because it revealed what had been buried under the noise. Two voices in a room, with nothing to fill the space between them except what they were actually saying. The silence in that episode is genuinely uncomfortable at points. The kind of silence that tells you something is about to be said, that needs the space around it to land. That silence is the show at its most honest. Not the noise. The noise is the show at its most comfortable. The silence is where the real story lives. Bonus section H. What the future holds and why the past still matters. In April of 2025, a deal was announced. Family Guy, already the longest-running primetime animated comedy in the history of American television, was renewed through season 27. The show would continue through the 2028 to 2029 television season, celebrating its 30th anniversary, with episodes still being made, still being voiced by the same cast, still existing in a world that had changed almost unrecognizably around it, while the Griffin family remained in their house on a street that the show has now called home for 3 decades. 30 years. The child who watched the first episode when it aired after the Super Bowl in 1999 is now, in 2025, a middle-aged person with their own children. The show that felt transgressive and sharp and strange when it premiered has outlasted several entire generations of television. Networks that existed when Family Guy first aired have changed or disappeared. Platforms that didn't exist when it started have become the primary way most people consume the show's back catalog. The world that produced Family Guy is unrecognizable from the one that is now renewing it through its 4th decade. What does it mean to still be making a show for 30 years? What does it mean to the show itself, to the characters, to the stories, to the relationship between the creative people making it and the material they're making? Seth MacFarlane, in an April 2024 interview, framed the show's continued existence in terms that were notable for their honesty. It makes people happy. It funds causes he cares about. It has reached what he called escape velocity. Not that he had burning new stories to tell about these characters. Not that there were creative territories left unexplored that demanded the show's continuation. The show was continuing because it could, and because stopping it would require a reason to stop it, and no reason had yet risen to that bar. There's something melancholy in that framing, and also something strangely appropriate. Family Guy was always a show that knew how to survive. It survived 2 cancellations. It survived a 3-year absence. It survived a writer's strike. It survived the loss of its creator's active involvement. It survived the migration of its audience from network television to streaming. It survived becoming genuinely unfashionable, critically dismissed, past whatever moment of cultural relevance it had once occupied. It survived all of these things and kept going. The survival instinct is baked into the show's DNA in a way that almost nothing else about it is. Maybe that's the show's real arc. Not the story of a family in Rhode Island, or the story of a dog who tried to write a novel, or the story of a baby who abandoned world domination in favor of friendship. The real arc of Family Guy is the story of a piece of entertainment that refused, against all odds and occasionally against its own interests, to stop. That kept renewing and returning and persisting through everything the television industry and its own creative limitations could throw at it. That's not a story the show has ever explicitly told about itself. But it's there, in the aggregate of everything that has happened since 1999, if you're looking for it. And the dark stories are there too. The ones told honestly, and the ones told clumsily, and the ones that were never quite told but gesturing toward. Visible in the gaps between the cutaways and the reset buttons and the endings that never stayed. They're all part of the same thing, a show that built something remarkable and then didn't quite know how to protect it, that contained both the best and the most disappointing versions of itself in the same house on the same street across 30 years of American television. The lights are on at the Griffin House. They have been on, without interruption, since the 31st of January 1999. They will remain on, apparently, through the end of the decade. Whatever happens inside that house next, whatever dark turns the writers find, whatever moments of unexpected honesty slip through between the noise and the gags, whatever version of Peter and Lois and the kids emerges from the next few seasons, it will be carrying the weight of everything that came before it. The bank vault and the simulation. The hurricane night and the street hockey game. The North Pole and the multiverse. The gun in the safety deposit box and the time machine and the dog who came back and the baby who chose to stay. All of that is still there, sealed inside 30 years of animation, waiting for whoever finds it. Thank you for spending this time here. Drop a like if any of this pulled you somewhere unexpected, and subscribe if you want more of exactly this kind of thing, these long, slow, careful dives into the stories underneath the stories. That's what we do here, and there's so much more to come. Sleep well. End of full script. Bonus section I. The episode that almost ended everything, and then there were fewer. Every ensemble show has, at some point, to reckon with the question of what happens when the guest list gets too long. When years of recurring characters and one-off appearances and fan favorites pile up into a cast that has grown beyond what any single episode can meaningfully contain. Family Guy handled this question in one of the most aggressive ways available to a television series. It gathered most of those recurring characters in one place and started killing them. Season 9 opened with, and then there were fewer, an extended premiere that placed the Griffin family and a rotating cast of recurring characters in a large mansion for a dinner party that quickly revealed itself to be Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, transplanted into the Family Guy universe and played with a genuine commitment to its source material's structure. Someone at the party had a grudge. People began dying. And unlike the show's usual relationship with character deaths, that same reversible, consequence-free relationship that defined most of what the show did with its recurring players, these deaths stuck. Muriel Goldman, wife of Mort and a quiet presence throughout the show's run, did not survive the episode. Derek Wilcox, a recurring character, did not survive. Diane Simmons, the Channel 5 news anchor who had appeared alongside Tom Tucker in the show's mock news segments since the very first season, a character whose reliability and consistent presence had made her feel genuinely embedded in the world. Diane Simmons died in this episode. Specifically, she was shot by Stewie Griffin, who had discovered that she was the killer. Who shot her before she could kill Meg? There is something almost shocking about the specific form of that resolution. Stewie Griffin, the increasingly softened and humanized version of the character who, by season 9, had largely abandoned his villainous origins, commits an act of genuinely cold execution to save Meg of all people. Meg? The person the rest of the family had spent several seasons treating with open contempt. He kills the killer. He does it calmly, efficiently, without apparent regret, and the show doesn't dwell on it. The episode ends. The dead remain dead. The world of the show absorbs the loss of several characters and moves on. What And Then There Were Fewer demonstrated was something the show rarely proved. When it committed to consequences, when it let things end and stay ended, when it agreed that the fictional world had weight, And that weight meant some things were genuinely irreversible. It could produce storytelling with actual dramatic tension. The episode worked because you couldn't be certain who would survive. The usual expectation that main characters are fine, that the world resets, that nothing important is permanently lost was suspended for 45 minutes. And in that suspension, the stakes felt real in a way they hadn't for years. The episode stands in uncomfortable contrast with what surrounds it in the show's larger arc. Brian dies and comes back. Stewie's simulation resets. Meg's rebellion evaporates. The parallel universe, Brian is disposed of without ceremony. But Muriel Goldman stays dead. Diane Simmons stays dead. The show chose, specifically in this episode, to honor the weight of what it depicted and then mostly return to its usual policies in the episodes that followed. Diane Simmons was voiced by Carrie Fisher for most of her run on the show. Fisher, who died in December 2016, brought a specific quality to the character that was irreplaceable. A dry wit and a slightly sardonic energy that made Diane feel like someone who had seen enough of the world to find most of it mildly ridiculous. Her death on the show predated Fisher's death in real life by 5 years. When Fisher passed away, the fictional death of her character took on an additional resonance, another layer of loss on top of the one that had already existed in the episode's record. The show dedicated Season 15, Episode 8, Carter and Tricia, to Carrie Fisher's memory. It was a small acknowledgement of a large absence. These are the moments when the boundaries between the fictional world and the real one become permeable in unexpected ways, when the people who give voice to fictional beings are lost, and the fictional beings carry the trace of that loss forward into stories that will continue without them. Bonus section? J. What Brian's novel never became the writer's block as character arc. There is a thread in Brian Griffin's story that runs from the very beginning of the show to its latest seasons, a thread so consistent and so persistent that it functions almost as the spine of his character, even when everything else about him changes. It is the thread of the unfinished novel. Brian is a writer. He has always been a writer. His self-identification as a writer, specifically as a literary writer, someone working on something of genuine substance and artistic seriousness, is present from the earliest episodes. He has a manuscript. He has a desk where he writes, or claims to write. He has the martini that he drinks while writing, or while not writing, which is more often the case. He has all the paraphernalia of the serious literary writer. What he does not have, for the vast majority of the show's run, is a finished book. The novel is the thing that never arrives. It is the promise Brian makes to himself and cannot keep, the ambition he carries without the capacity or the discipline to realize it. In the early seasons, this was handled with a gentle melancholy. Brian's failed writerly ambitions were part of the texture of his character. One of the ways the show acknowledged that intelligence and talent are not the same thing as achievement, that someone can be genuinely gifted and still unable to complete the work that would prove it to themselves and the world. It was sympathetic writing, the kind that understood something true about creative failure. As the seasons progressed and Brian's character drifted toward arrogance and pretension, the unfinished novel became something different. It became evidence of the gap between Brian's self-image and his actual record, the most specific and concrete proof that his claim to being a serious intellectual and serious artist was built on very little actual foundation. He talked about writing. He talked about the importance of authentic literature. He positioned himself as someone with a genuine creative vision worth respecting. And the novel stayed in the drawer, unfinished, year after year. When Brian finally publishes something in the Season 9 episode, Brian Writes a Bestseller, the book is not the novel. It is a self-help book, Wish It, Want It, Do It, the most anti-literary genre imaginable for a character who has positioned himself as a literary, serious person. And the book is a massive bestseller, which should be a moment of at least complicated triumph for someone who has wanted to be taken seriously as a writer for so long. Instead, what the episode reveals is that success does not change Brian in the direction you might hope. It amplifies the worst aspects of his character. The arrogance that had been contained by his actual record of failure becomes grotesque when given commercial validation. He becomes someone who was perhaps almost tolerable as a failing artist, and is distinctly less tolerable as a successful one. The episode takes something that was, in the early seasons, a sympathetic flaw, the gap between Brian's ambitions and his output, and shows what happens when the gap is filled in the wrong way. Not by the patient work of becoming the writer he always claimed to want to be, but by the shortcut of a product that sells without requiring the depth he had always claimed to value. It is, in retrospect, one of the most economical pieces of character writing the later seasons produced. Brian writes a bestseller, says more about the specific kind of person Brian had become than almost any other episode from that era, precisely because it takes his central characteristic, the unfinished novel, the writerly identity, the claim to be something more serious than the context allowed, and shows you what that characteristic looks like when it's forced to make good on its own promises. The novel does eventually get completed in the show's later run. Season 12's Brian's novel involves Brian finally finishing the book and submitting it for publication, only to discover that the industry is not interested, that the book that represents his most genuine creative effort is not commercially viable in the way his self-help embarrassment was. This is a moment of genuine pathos, the thing he spent years working toward, finally achieved, meeting a wall of indifference from the very world he had wanted to impress. But the show doesn't linger on this the way it might have in the early seasons. The beat lands, and then the episode moves on, and the emotional weight of the moment doesn't fully develop. What the unfinished novel, finally finished, and rejected thread reveals, when you trace it from beginning to end, is a character whose relationship with his own ambition is the most honest thing about him. Everything else in Brian's arc is complicated by the flanderization, by the arrogance and hypocrisy and self-serving behavior of the later seasons. But the desire to write something real, something that would justify his self-image and prove that the literary pretension had always been pointing towards something genuine, that desire is consistent and sincere across the entire run. Even when Brian is at his worst as a person, the novel is still there, still unfinished, or finished and rejected, or published in the wrong form and celebrated for the wrong reasons, always slightly out of reach. That's the most human thing about him, the thing that persists underneath all the ways the character drifted from what he was supposed to be, the gap between who he wanted to be and what he was able to manage. And maybe that's why Stewie's speech at the end of Brian and Stewie, telling Brian that he admires him, hits the way it does. Not because Brian has earned that admiration through achievement, but because the desire, the reach, the persistent willingness to believe he could be something worth admiring that counts for something, even when it doesn't produce the work. Bonus Section K. The Giant Chicken's Real Lesson: What Keeps Coming Back. Let us return briefly to the chicken. Not to the chicken fights themselves, those have been addressed, their escalating violence and their proportional absurdity already examined, but to the chicken as a narrative object, as a recurring element in a long-running show that has, for its entire run, refused to fully explain why the conflict exists in the form it takes, or why it keeps recurring, or what it would mean for it to end. Ernie the Giant Chicken has been in at least 6 major appearances across the show's run. He and Peter have destroyed neighborhoods, office buildings, ships, and any number of other environments in their ongoing battle. Between appearances, there is no indication of ongoing hostility, no evidence that Peter spends his off-screen time nursing the grudge, no subplot involving planning or preparation. The chicken simply reappears, the conflict reactivates, and the destruction begins again. This pattern, the periodic return of an unresolved conflict, the inability to either resolve it finally or let it go, the escalating damage that each recurrence produces without producing any change in the underlying situation, is a pattern that recurs throughout the show's storytelling, in contexts far more meaningful than a running gag. Brian and Quagmire fight, get worse, fight again. Peter does terrible things to Meg, occasionally recognizes this, resets, and does terrible things to Meg again. The show gestures at change and then reverses it. The conflict returns. The damage accumulates. The chicken fight is, in this reading, not just a fan-favorite recurring bit. It is the show's cleanest metaphor for its own narrative psychology. A conflict so embedded in the structure of the show that it cannot be resolved without changing what the show is, so it persists, each recurrence more elaborate and more destructive than the last, with the combatants returning to their ordinary lives afterward as if the battle had not happened and would not happen again. Except it always does happen again, and the damage always does accumulate, and the expired coupon that started it all, the original slight, the first grievance, the thing that set all of this in motion recedes further and further into the background with every additional fight, until the conflict exists almost entirely as its own justification. They fight because they have always fought. The reason no longer matters. The pattern is the reason. There is something uncomfortable about this when you let yourself see it. A show that is aware enough of its own patterns to make a comedy bit out of them, but not quite willing or able to step outside those patterns and do something genuinely different. The chicken keeps coming back. The conflicts never resolve. The show keeps going, season after season, carrying its history in a way that acknowledges it without fully confronting it. Until, eventually, you reach the point where the show has been running for 30 years, and the chicken is still out there somewhere, and Peter has never fully dealt with the coupon, and the fight could always happen again. The next time Peter steps outside and looks across the yard and sees a giant rooster standing in the street, everything will begin again. The neighborhood will suffer. The conflict will escalate. Property damage will be spectacular. And then it will be over. And everyone will go home. And the same will be true of everything that was true before it started. That is, perhaps, the most honest metaphor the show has ever offered for itself. Not the cutaway universe with its rapid-fire associations, not the multiverse remote sliding between realities, not the time machine undoing what was done. The chicken. The eternal return of the unresolved grievance. The conflict that cannot be finished, because finishing it would mean admitting that it was never worth starting. Bonus section L. The drunken clam and what it meant to belong somewhere. Close your eyes one more time. Picture a bar. Not an exciting bar, not the kind of place people go to see and be seen. Not a stylish venue with carefully curated lighting. A neighborhood bar. Old wood on the bar top, worn smooth by years of elbows and glasses. A television in the corner showing whatever game happens to be on. A specific cluster of bar stools that belong, by informal agreement, to the same group of men who have been occupying them for years. The smell of beer and something fried. The comfortable noise of a place that has no ambition to be anything other than what it is. This is the drunken clam, and for the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, it was one of the show's most effective settings, not because of anything dramatic that happened there, but because of what it represented. It was where Peter Griffin belonged, where he was entirely himself, with the people who knew him entirely, in a place that had no expectations of him beyond showing up and having a drink. The friendships formed at the Drunken Clam, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, Cleveland were drawn in those early seasons with a warmth and specificity that the show's more comedically ambitious storytelling sometimes overshadowed. These were men who had established, over the course of years of regular company, a set of shared references and comfortable silences and recurring jokes that belonged specifically to them. They had developed the shorthand of genuine long-term friendship, the kind that lets you communicate something complex with a raised eyebrow or a specific pause, because you've known each other long enough for the language to compact itself into gestures. This kind of male friendship, unglamorous, neighborhood scale, built on the accumulation of ordinary time spent in each other's company, is something that television has always struggled to depict without either sentimentalizing it or mocking it. The early seasons of Family Guy found a register that was neither a clear-eyed, affectionate portrait of what it actually looks like when men who are not particularly articulate about their inner lives maintain genuine care for each other across years of ordinary proximity. The bar scenes in seasons 1 through 3 have a texture that later seasons couldn't quite recover. The 4 of them sitting there, Peter enormous and loud and occupying far more space than anyone around him strictly welcomes, Joe steady and capable and a little quieter than the others, Quagmire adding his particular color to everything, Cleveland providing the warmth and the patience that the group's dynamics required. These scenes felt like something that was really being observed rather than constructed for comic purposes. As the seasons progressed, the Drunken Clam retained its physical presence in the show's world but lost some of what had made it matter. Cleveland's departure for Virginia created a gap that the show acknowledged as a plot point but never fully filled in emotional terms. The friendship group that remained, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, functioned differently without Cleveland's stabilizing presence. The dynamics shifted. Things that had been counterbalanced by Cleveland's particular brand of patience became unbalanced without him. And Peter's character change affected everything at the bar as well. The Drunken Clam scenes in later seasons feature a Peter Griffin who is harder to like in the context of friendship, a Peter who does things to his friends that the early Peter wouldn't have done, who uses the relationships for his own ends in ways that undercut the idea that these are genuine friendships rather than habitual proximities. The bar remains, the stools remain, the television in the corner remains, but the specific texture of belonging that those early scenes carried has thinned. There is an episode in the show's long run, one of the quieter ones, one that doesn't appear on anyone's best episodes list or most disturbing list, where Peter and his friends are just at the bar, just sitting there, not on an adventure, not navigating a plot complication, just drinking beer and watching the game and being in each other's company. And in that episode, for a few minutes, the show remembers what the drunken clam was for. What friendship looks like when you're not asking it to be funny or dramatic or meaningful, when you're letting it just be what it is. Those minutes feel like something recovered, like the show reaching back through all the seasons and all the character changes and all the cutaways and finding, briefly, the thing that was always underneath them. The simple, warm, unremarkable pleasure of being exactly where you belong, with people who know exactly who you are. The Griffin's house on Spooner Street, the drunken clam 2 blocks over, a television on in the corner, a group of friends who have been sitting at these same stools for longer than anyone thought they would be. Outside, the Rhode Island autumn is doing whatever autumn does, the light going golden earlier each day, the temperature dropping in that particular way that Rhode Island autumns drop, the leaves turning and falling on streets that have held the same houses and the same families for decades. It is, when you let it be, genuinely peaceful. This little fictional world and the people in it, good and bad and complicated and occasionally terrible, living out their loud and imperfect lives in a place that has held them through everything that has happened to them. The family is still there. The bar is still open. The game is on. You can close your eyes and let it carry you wherever you're going tonight. The road goes wherever the road goes. And we'll be back to walk some more of it soon. Thank you for being here. Wherever you are and whatever time it is, thank you for spending it with these stories. Hit subscribe if you haven't, it really does help more than you'd think. And sleep well. The Griffin House will still be there tomorrow. End of complete script. Bonus section M. The Simpsons crossover and the mirror it held up. There is a specific kind of television event that only becomes possible when two long-running shows have both existed long enough to have earned a complicated relationship with each other. Family Guy had one of those events in Season 13, Episode 1, which aired the 28th of September 2014. The episode is titled The Simpsons Guy, and it runs for nearly an hour, and it is the only time in the history of American animated television that the two most important animated comedies of the late 20th and early 21st centuries shared a screen. The premise is almost aggressively simple. Through a series of events beginning with Peter's comic strip offending women everywhere in Stoolbend in Rhode Island, Peter's town, the Griffins flee by car and end up stranded in Springfield. The Simpsons take them in. Two families who have, in their separate universes, been doing essentially the same thing for decades, living in a medium-sized American town, raising a chaotic family, getting into trouble, recovering from it, returning to baseline, spend an episode in each other's company. The episode knows exactly what it is doing. It knows that every person watching has an opinion about both shows, about which is better and why, about what each represents in the history of television comedy, and what each has become in its later years relative to what it started as. The episode doesn't try to evade these comparisons. It leans into them, directly and with something between confidence and self-awareness. The most interesting thing The Simpsons Guy does, from the perspective of what this script has been examining, is what happens when the two families' daughters meet, Lisa Simpson and Meg Griffin. Two teenage girls in animated families who could not be more different in how the shows around them treat them. Lisa is one of The Simpsons' most celebrated characters, a genuine intellectual, a moral center, someone the show has consistently treated with respect and developed with care across decades. Meg is, by season 13, only beginning to emerge from the decade of mistreatment that had defined her post-revival existence. Lisa sees Meg clearly. Not with pity, pity would be condescending, but with the specific kind of recognition that comes from one person who has felt unseen, looking at another and seeing the thing they recognize. She encourages Meg. She helps Meg discover that she has musical talent, a saxophone player recognizing potential in someone who had not been given the opportunity to develop what was always there. They become genuine friends. It is a warm, well-written interaction that says more about what Meg could have been in a show that cared for her the way The Simpsons cared for Lisa than almost anything in the episodes surrounding it. The broader crossover also functions as an inadvertent family portrait of two shows at different stages of a similar journey. The Simpsons had its own complicated relationship with the gap between its early brilliance and its later seasons. Family Guy's relationship with that gap was different in kind and degree. But in the same frame, side by side, You could see both shows' characters clearly enough to feel the difference in how each had been treated by its creators over the years. The Simpsons characters, for all the criticism of their later seasons, retained something legible about who they had originally been. The Family Guy characters, by season 13, were further from their origins in ways that the contrast made visible. The episode ends with a chicken versus Homer fight that substitutes Homer Simpson for Ernie the Giant Chicken, extending the tradition to another beloved animated family. It's funny because the audience knows both texts well enough to understand exactly what's being honored and exactly what's being made fun of simultaneously. That dual register awareness, the show saying one thing while knowing the audience is hearing another, is Family Guy at its most technically skilled. And somewhere inside the episode, before the chicken fight and the Homer versus Peter showdown and all the other set pieces, two animated girls found each other in a world that hadn't always been kind to either of them and recognized something shared. Meg Griffin, for one episode, was treated by a crossover event exactly the way she should always have been treated by her own show, as someone worth seeing. Bonus section N. The Long Quiet of the Later Seasons, a meditation on persistence. There is a question that every very long-running television show eventually has to answer, or at least acknowledge that it cannot answer. At what point does persistence become its own justification? At what point does a show continue not because it has more to say, but because it has been saying things long enough that stopping would require a reason as large as the run itself? Family Guy is at that point now, has been at that point for some time, by most measures. The ratings data makes it clear. The audience that watches new episodes of Family Guy in its current form is a fraction less than 10% of the audience that watched it at its peak in the revival years. The show has been moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights, a scheduling demotion that speaks clearly about the network's assessment of its current cultural weight. The man who created it has signed deals that make it equally clear where his creative energy and professional enthusiasm now live. And yet the show continues, and will continue apparently through season 27, through the 30th anniversary, through whatever the television landscape looks like in 2029. What does it mean to watch a show through all of that? To be someone who was there for the first episode and is still there, or would be there, if they knew where to find it on a Wednesday night for the season 27 finale? What does it mean to have had a relationship with a piece of entertainment for 3 decades? To have watched it be brilliant, and then less brilliant, and then significantly less brilliant than that? To have watched its characters become something different from what they were, and then partially recover and then drift again? It means, probably, something different for every person who has been doing it. For some, it means the comfort of familiarity, the specific pleasure of returning to a world whose geography you know by heart, whose character voices are so deeply embedded in your memory that hearing them is like hearing an old song, the recognition preceding the content. For others, it means something more complicated, the ongoing relationship with a thing that has disappointed them, that they're still watching partly out of habit and partly out of the stubborn belief that something might still surprise them. Both of these are legitimate ways to watch a very long-running show, and Family Guy, for all its decline, has never entirely stopped surprising people. There are episodes in the most recent seasons that critics who had written the show off acknowledged were better than they expected. There are individual jokes and scenes and moments scattered through even the weakest later seasons that recall what the show was at its height. The talent has never entirely gone away. It has just been allocated differently, deployed less consistently, subject to pressures and priorities that the creative people making the show could not always fully control. What the later seasons of Family Guy have, that its early seasons couldn't have, is the accumulated weight of everything that came before them. The characters in a season 25 episode are not the characters of season 1. They are the same characters after 24 years of additional history. 24 years of choices made and not made, 24 years of the show, trying and occasionally succeeding and more often settling. That history is there. It's in the voice performances, in the casual references to past events that the show's mythology has built up, in the specific way these characters carry themselves after everything that has happened to them. Brian Griffin in season 25 is not just Brian Griffin. He is Brian Griffin who died and came back, who wrote a bestseller and found it hollow, who kept a gun in a vault and confessed it to a baby who became his best friend. He carries all of that, even when the individual episode doesn't reference any of it. The weight of the character's history is present in him whether the writers acknowledge it or not. This is, perhaps, the most compelling argument for sticking with a show through its long decline. Not that the later seasons are as good as the early ones. they aren't. But that the characters in the later seasons are richer than they would be without all those seasons behind them. The accumulated history creates a depth that doesn't always show on the surface but is there when you look for it. A season 25 joke about Brian's pretension lands differently, carries more weight, is funnier and sadder simultaneously when you know everything that happened to bring Brian to this specific expression of his specific failure. The Griffin family is, in this sense, a genuine portrait of something that takes 30 years to paint, not a flattering one, not a triumphant one, but a real one, with the imperfections and the missed opportunities and the moments of accidental brilliance and the long stretches of ordinary that real portraits require. Settle back. Let it be what it is. The street is quiet outside. The house is lit from within. The television is on, blue and warm in the living room. The family is home. They've always been home. And 30 years in, the fact of that, the persistent, unlikely, sometimes beautiful and sometimes troubling fact of all those years of them existing and arguing and failing and occasionally loving each other, truly is its own kind of remarkable thing. Close your eyes. You know where this street is. You've always known. Sleep well. Total script complete. Bonus section O. The animation and what it carried, how the show felt before it looked. Long before any word of dialogue is spoken in a Family Guy episode, the animation has already told you something. Not through the plot, through the specific quality of how the images move, whether the lines are loose or rigid, whether the characters express themselves with their whole bodies or only with their faces, whether the backgrounds have a lived-in texture or the slightly depopulated cleanliness of digital production shortcuts. Animation is not just a medium of delivery, it is itself a carrier of feeling. In the first 2 seasons of Family Guy, the animation was handled primarily by Rough Draft Studios, working from designs by Seth MacFarlane and his team. The result had a quality that's difficult to quantify but easy to feel. It was alive in a way that later seasons weren't. The characters moved with a looseness and expressiveness that matched the show's humor. Peter's pratfalls had a physical comedy that landed better because his body had genuine weight and momentum behind it. Brian's subtle facial expressions, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible set to his mouth communicated character in ways that didn't require dialogue. Even the backgrounds had something of a handmade warmth. The Rhode Island neighborhoods and the houses and the bar, having the organic imperfection of environments that had been built by people who cared about the specific place they were building. When the show came back in 2005 after its 3-year absence, the animation had changed. It was cleaner, technically more consistent, more polished in the way that digital production enabled polish. But something had gone with the roughness, some energy, some sense that the world on screen was alive rather than produced. The characters moved more stiffly, expressions were more limited. The backgrounds had the too clean quality of environments rendered rather than drawn in the older, looser sense. This shift mattered more than purely aesthetic discussions of animation style might suggest, because in a comedy specifically, animation quality is timing. The way a face moves when a joke lands determines whether the joke lands fully or only partially. The physical comedy of a character like Peter Griffin depends entirely on whether his body behaves like a body, whether it has mass and momentum, and the specific way that mass and momentum interact with obstacles. When the animation becomes more rigid, the physical comedy becomes less physical. It becomes something performed rather than something felt. By seasons 6 and 7, different studios were handling different portions of each season, and the inconsistency showed. Particular episodes looked noticeably different from others. The character models varied in ways that attentive viewers noticed immediately. The show's visual continuity, which had never been its primary concern, became actively distracting in the gap years, a symptom of a production trying to maintain output volume against budgets and schedules that didn't always align with ambitions. The irony of this is that the show's animation improved technically as the seasons progressed, in the sense that individual frames became more detailed and the rendering more sophisticated. But the improvement was in the wrong direction. What the early show had expressiveness, energy, the feeling that every frame had a person behind it making a decision about what it should do that didn't improve with budget. It had been present when the budget was lower because it was the product of care and enthusiasm rather than technical capacity. And care and enthusiasm are not things that scale with production budgets. There are moments in the later seasons' animation that are genuinely impressive as technical achievements. The chicken fights, particularly the more elaborate later iterations, are choreographed and animated with real skill. The The spatial complexity of those sequences, the number of elements moving simultaneously, the attention to physical cause and effect, represent a significant investment of craft. But they represent craft deployed in service of spectacle rather than character. The technical accomplishment doesn't translate into a moment of genuine feeling. Road to the Multiverse, which won its director Greg Colton a Primetime Emmy for individual achievement in animation, contains the Disney Universe sequence, a parody of old Disney animation executed with enough precision to function as both homage and comedy. That sequence works because the animators had to actually understand what they were parodying well enough to recreate its qualities intentionally rather than accidentally. The round, bouncy character designs, the specific color palette, the way characters move in that tradition, all of it is right because someone knew what right looked like and had the skill to achieve it. For 3 or 4 minutes, the show produced animation of genuine quality in service of something genuinely funny. It stands out because it's surrounded by so much that reached less high. The animation of Brian and Stewie the Bank Vault episode takes a different kind of quality seriously. Without cutaways to cut to, without location changes to animate, without secondary characters to populate the frame, the episode is almost entirely 2 characters sitting and talking. And the animators had to make that interesting. Had to find a way to carry 21 minutes of essentially static composition without losing the audience. What they found was a kind of careful attention to small movement, the way Brian holds his scotch glass, the way Stewie's expressions change as the conversation becomes more serious, the specific physical distance between them that shifts as the episode progresses. Small things, but precisely the things that animated character performance depends on when there's nothing else for the eye to rest on. That episode demonstrates something that the show's approach to animation had largely moved away from by season 8, the understanding that still, quiet, character-focused scenes require as much animating skill as the spectacular set pieces. They require a different kind of skill, one more focused on subtlety and restraint, on the specific language of small physical gestures that communicate emotional states without announcing them. When the show committed to that kind of storytelling, the animation had to commit with it. And in Brian and Stewie, it did. This is not simply a lament for the rougher animation of the early seasons, which had its own limitations alongside its energy. It is an observation about a show that gradually moved toward technical sophistication while moving away from the kind of expressive quality that technical sophistication was meant to serve. The tools got better. What was being built with them became, in aggregate, less alive. The early seasons of Family Guy looked like they were made by people who were excited to be making them. That excitement is visible in the frames and the looseness, in the risk-taking of physical comedy that required animated bodies to do things that stiff, clean character models couldn't manage, in the decision to give Brian the specific set of his mouth that communicated, "I know this is going to end badly, and I'm along for it anyway," in the way Peter's entire body participated in his reactions rather than just his face registering the appropriate expression. Animation is time-specific moments, chosen from infinite possible moments, each one a decision about what the audience should see and feel. The show made better decisions with that time, overall in the seasons when it was learning what it was. And then it learned, and grew, and became more technically capable, and the decisions became more automatic and less thoughtful, more confident and less curious, more produced and less alive. The house on Spooner Street still stands in the animation. The sun still sets over it in the establishing shots. The family inside it still moves through their lives in the specific way they've always moved, with the specific voices they've always had, and the specific patterns of behavior that 30 years of television have established as their defining characteristics. And somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the technical improvements and the scheduling changes and the character flanderization and the cutaway dependency and all the rest of it, there is a drawing of a family in a house that someone made once because they had an idea, and the idea was good, and for a while the drawing was exactly as alive as the idea deserved. That drawing is still there. You can still find it, if you go back far enough. It is still exactly as good as it always was. And that is worth remembering as you drift off tonight. That somewhere at the beginning of all of this, before all of the complications and the changes and the long middle stretch and the slow later years, someone sat down with an idea and made something genuinely wonderful out of it. Something that deserved the love it received. Something that, at its very best, understood exactly what it was doing and did it brilliantly. The beginning is still there. clean and intact, waiting. Sleep well. Full script complete. Thank you for making it this far. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching this. See you next time. A final note before you sleep. You've spent a long time here tonight, and that means something. Most people don't stay. Most people let these long, slow videos play in the background while they do something else, folding laundry, scrolling through their phone, letting the sound fill the room without really listening. That's fine. That's what this format is for, in part. Being present without demanding full attention. Being company in the specific way that a familiar voice in a dark room can be company. But if you're still here, actually here, having followed these stories about a fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town all the way to this final page, then you are the person these videos are made for. You're the one who understands that there's more going on inside a long-running animated comedy than the surface-level gags and the shock jokes and the rotating cast of voice actors. You understand that stories accumulate meaning over time. That characters who have been around long enough develop a kind of weight that their creators didn't always intend and can't always fully control. That the dark episodes and the sad ones, and the ones where nothing resolves the way it should are, in their own way, as important as the funny ones, maybe more important, because they're the ones where the show revealed what it actually thought about the people it had invented. The Griffin family is not a real family. Brian Griffin never actually died on Spooner Street. Stewie's computer simulation never happened in any sense that matters to the actual universe. Meg Griffin's years of abuse were drawn by animators and written by writers and voiced by an actress who went on to have a remarkable career, largely independent of this specific role. None of it is real. And yet something in it is. Something in the specific way these characters were drawn in the best episodes, by the people who cared most about getting it right, is real in the way that all good storytelling is real. Not in its facts, but in its feelings. In the truth it touches even while making things up. Brian keeping something frightening in a safety deposit box because there are days he doesn't want to be alive is not a fact about a fictional dog. It is an observation about a particular kind of person. Quiet, intelligent, privately struggling, maintaining a social surface that hides the actual difficulty of getting through each day. That observation is real. It recognizes something real. It is why the Bank Vault episode landed the way it did for the people it landed with. Stories are the way we recognize each other across all the distances between us. The distance of different lives and different circumstances and different kinds of pain and different kinds of joy. A cartoon dog in a bank vault is not you. But some piece of what that cartoon dog felt in that moment was yours, and the show for 21 minutes in its 8th season knew exactly how to reach it. That's what we come back for. Every time. That's what keeps these very long, very slow, very specific videos finding their audience at 2 in the morning on a night that needed something to fill the quiet with. We're looking for the thing that sees us, the story that knows something true, the voice in the dark that sounds, just slightly, like it understands. I hope this one was that, for someone. Close your eyes. The street is quiet. The house is there. The lights are on. Sleep well. We'll do it all again next time.